I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 30 years now. It was late October 1858, and I was helping out on my uncle's farm just outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The air had that crisp autumn chill to it, and the leaves were starting to turn those beautiful shades of red and gold. I'd been staying with my uncle and aunt for a few weeks, lending a hand with the harvest and general farm work. It was hard labor, but I enjoyed the simplicity of farm life compared to the bustle of Philadelphia where I normally lived. That particular evening, I'd finished up my chores early and decided to take a walk before supper to enjoy the sunset. As I strolled along the edge of the woods that bordered the farm, I had this odd feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. But I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze and a few birds flitting about. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. When I got back to the farmhouse, my aunt was busy preparing supper. The savory aroma of her famous beef stew filled the air, making my mouth water. My uncle was sitting at the kitchen table looking troubled. "Everything all right, Uncle John?" I asked, as I washed up at the sink. He sighed heavily. "I'm worried about the cows, Thomas. Bessie's milk production has dropped off sharply the past few days, and she seems skittish. And this morning I noticed some strange marks on her udder." I furrowed my brow, concerned. The dairy cows were the lifeblood of the farm. "What kind of marks?" "Almost like bite marks or scratches, but larger than any critter around these parts would leave. I'm afraid we might have a bear problem." A chill ran down my spine as I recalled that eerie, watched feeling from my walk. But surely a bear wouldn't come this close to the farm buildings, would it? We discussed it over supper, and my uncle decided we should take turns keeping watch over the barn that night, just in case. I volunteered for the first shift, from sunset until midnight. As darkness fell, I made my way out to the barn, lantern in hand. The horses nickered softly as I entered, but the cows seemed restless, shifting uneasily in their stalls. I tried to calm them, speaking in low, soothing tones as I checked that all was secure. For the next few hours, I paced back and forth, straining my ears for any unusual sounds. But all was quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of mice in the hay. My eyelids grew heavy as midnight approached. Just a few more minutes, I told myself, stifling a yawn. Suddenly, a loud thump from the far end of the barn jolted me fully awake. My heart racing, I held the lantern high and peered into the shadows. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. "Is someone there?" No response, but I could hear something moving, a sort of shuffling sound. Swallowing hard, I crept forward, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. As I neared Bessie's stall, I heard a wet, slurping noise that made my skin crawl. I rounded the corner, and the lantern slipped from my nerveless fingers, crashing to the floor. There, crouched beside Bessie, was the most terrifying creature I'd ever laid eyes on. It was man-shaped, but covered head to toe in coarse, matted hair. Its face was a twisted parody of humanity, flat nose, protruding brow, and eyes that glowed with an unholy light in the lantern's flickering flame. But worst of all were its hands, huge, gnarled things ending in wicked claws that were latched onto poor Bessie's udder. For a moment, we just stared at each other, frozen in mutual shock. Then the thing let out a blood-curdling shriek that chilled me to my very soul. It reared up to its full height, easily 7 feet tall, and I saw that its mouth was stained with fresh blood. I scrambled backwards, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. "Help!" I screamed, my voice cracking in terror. "Uncle John, help!" The monster lunged towards me with frightening speed. I threw myself to the side, feeling the rush of air as those deadly claws barely missed me. I rolled to my feet and sprinted for the barn doors, not daring to look back. I burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. Behind me, I heard the thing crashing through the barn. My uncle came running from the house, shotgun in hand. "Thomas, what in God's name is going on?" he shouted. Before I could answer, the creature exploded out of the barn. In the moonlight, it looked even more horrifying. My uncle let out a strangled cry and raised his shotgun, but before he could fire, the beast leapt, soaring over our heads with impossible agility. It hit the ground running, bounding across the field like a deer, and disappeared into the dark woods beyond. We stood there for several long moments, too stunned to speak. Finally, my uncle turned to me, his face ashen. "What? What was that thing?" I shook my head, still trembling. I don't know. It was like a wild man. But no man could move like that. Word spread quickly through Lancaster County about the incident at our farm. Some folks thought we were spinning tall tales, but others came forward with their own strange sightings. Old Widow Jenkins swore she'd seen a hairy giant raiding her chicken coop. The Miller boys claimed they'd found enormous human-like footprints down by the creek. A hunting party was organized to track down the creature, but they found no trace of it. As the days passed with no further incidents, people began to relax and life returned to normal. But I never forgot what I saw that night in the barn. To this day, I can't explain what that thing was. Some kind of undiscovered animal, an escaped circus freak, or something more supernatural. All I know is that it was real, and it was terrifying. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining those glowing eyes and blood-stained claws reaching for me in the dark. I've never returned to Lancaster County, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of that night is seared into my brain, a constant reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting to remind us that we are not as safe as we'd like to believe. So if you're ever in the Pennsylvania countryside and feel those hairs stand up on the back of your neck, like you're being watched, don't ignore it. And whatever you do, don't go investigating strange noises in the barn at night. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 2. The day started like any other. I woke at dawn, had a meager breakfast of beans and hardtack, and set out with my tools to continue working my claim along a promising creek. The air was already stifling hot by mid-morning, and I was drenched in sweat as I sifted through the gravelly soil. It must have been around noon when I first sensed something was off. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no squirrels scampering about. Even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt eyes upon me. Slowly, I straightened up and scanned the tree line, my heart beginning to race. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, partially obscured behind a large oak, was a massive, dark figure. At first I thought it must be a bear, but as I squinted to get a better look, I realized with dawning horror that its shape was all wrong. It was vaguely man-like but enormous, easily 8 or 9 feet tall. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging down past its knees. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. The creature and I stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel the intensity of its gaze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that any sudden movement might provoke an attack. Suddenly, the beast let out a bone-chilling roar that echoed through the mountains. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. Before I could react, it burst into motion with terrifying speed. In 3 enormous strides, it closed half the distance between us. Panic overtook me, and I turned to flee. I abandoned my tools and ran blindly through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear the creature crashing through the forest behind me, gaining ground with every second. My legs burned and my lungs heaved as I sprinted for my life. Just when I thought it was about to overtake me, I broke through the tree line into a small clearing. Without breaking stride, I made for a sturdy-looking pine tree and scrambled up as fast as I could. I didn't stop climbing until I was a good 30 feet off the ground. Clinging to the trunk, I looked down and nearly lost my grip in shock. The creature had followed me into the clearing and now stood at the base of my tree. In the full sunlight, I could finally see it clearly. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur ranging from reddish-brown to black. The face was flat and ape-like, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with predatory intelligence. But most horrifying were its hands. Massive things easily twice the size of my own, tipped with vicious-looking claws. The beast circled the tree, looking for a way up. To my relief, the lower branches were too high for it to reach. It let out another ear-splitting roar, this time tinged with frustration. Then, to my utter astonishment, it strode over to a fallen tree trunk nearby. The log was massive, at least 20 feet long and 2 feet thick. With a display of strength that defied belief, the creature hoisted the entire trunk over its head. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. No animal should have been capable of such a feat. With a grunt of effort, the beast hurled the giant log at my tree. It crashed into the trunk below me with bone-jarring force. The entire tree shuddered, and for a moment I was sure it would topple over. But miraculously, it held firm. The creature howled in rage and began picking up rocks and hurling them at me. I pressed myself against the trunk, trying to present as small a target as possible. Most of the projectiles missed, but a few found their mark. One struck my shoulder with bruising force, nearly causing me to lose my grip. This continued for what felt like hours, though it was likely only 20 minutes or so. Eventually the beast seemed to tire of the game. With a final roar of frustration, it lumbered back into the forest and out of sight. I remained frozen in place, straining my ears for any sound of its return. But the woods had fallen silent once again. I don't know how long I stayed in that tree. The sun was low on the horizon by the time I finally worked up the courage to climb down. My limbs were stiff and sore, and my shoulder throbbed where the rock had struck it. I gathered what remaining gear I could find and set off at a dead run back to my camp. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had me bolt upright, certain the creature had returned. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up my meager belongings and headed for civilization. I didn't care about my claim or the gold I might be leaving behind. I just wanted to get as far away from those mountains as possible. For weeks after, I jumped at every shadow and flinched at every unexpected sound. I told my story to a few fellow prospectors, but most just laughed it off as the ravings of a man gone mad from too much sun and solitude. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince anyone. But I know what I saw that day. It's been years now, and I've never returned to the Lancaster Mountains. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if it was just a vivid hallucination brought on by heat stroke and exhaustion. But then I'll catch a glimpse of the scars on my shoulder from where those rocks struck me, and I know it was all too real. I've heard whispers over the years of other sightings in those mountains, stories of giant ape-like creatures lurking in the wilderness. Some call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The locals have taken to calling it the abominable snowman, though there's precious little snow in those parts. Whatever it was, I hope to God I never encounter it again. The memory of those inhuman eyes still haunts my dreams. I can't shake the feeling that I was lucky to escape with my life that day, and I shudder to think what might have happened if that beast had managed to get its hands on me. So if you're ever in the Lancaster Mountains, keep your wits about you. And if the forest suddenly goes quiet and you feel eyes upon you, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that man was never meant to encounter, and once you've seen them, you can never truly unsee them. I'll carry the weight of that day with me for the rest of my life, The terror, the disbelief, the sheer impossibility of what I witnessed. It changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. All I know for certain is that there are dark corners of this world where monsters still roam, and I, for one, am content to leave them to their domain. Story 3. I was just a young boy when it happened, but the memory of that day on Manitu Island still haunts me even now, over 50 years later. It was the summer of 1868, and my family had traveled to the island for a fishing trip. My father was an avid fisherman and had heard tales of the abundant trout in Lake Michigan near the island. We had set up camp near the shore, surrounded by dense forest. That fateful morning, I woke early, before the rest of my family. The air was crisp and cool, mist hanging low over the lake. I decided to explore the woods a bit, while waiting for everyone else to wake up. As I wandered deeper into the forest, I had an eerie feeling of being watched. The birds had gone silent, and there was an unnatural stillness in the air. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. A massive, hair-covered creature, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It stood at least 8 feet tall, towering over me. Its body was completely covered in long, matted hair, but its face had an uncanny, human-like quality. The forehead was high and pronounced, and a long beard flowed down to its stomach. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both frozen in shock. Its eyes seemed to hold an intelligence, almost a sadness. Then it let out a bone-chilling shriek that echoed through the trees. I stumbled backwards in terror as the creature turned and fled with incredible speed, crashing through the underbrush. Heart pounding, I ran back to our campsite as fast as my legs could carry me. I burst out of the tree line, gasping for breath, and nearly collided with my father, who was just emerging from the tent. "Whoa there, son! What's got you in such a fright?" he asked, steadying me. Between pants, I managed to stammer out what I'd seen. At first, my father looked skeptical, but as I described the creature in detail, his expression grew grave. He questioned me thoroughly about every aspect of my encounter. Word spread quickly through the small community on the island. A group of local hunters gathered, determined to track down this mysterious beast. My father joined them, despite my mother's protests. I begged to go too, driven by a mix of fascination and terror, but was firmly told to stay at the camp. The hunting party set out, armed with rifles and tracking dogs. I paced anxiously at the camp all day, jumping at every snapping twig. As dusk fell, the men returned, looking weary and frustrated. They had found massive footprints and broken branches showing the creature's path, but it had eluded them at every turn. The dogs would follow the trail for a while, then suddenly lose the scent, as if the creature had vanished into thin air. That night, huddled around the campfire, the older islanders began to share stories. One elderly man recalled rumors from his youth of a young child who had vanished without a trace on the island decades ago. Some had suspected a bear attack at the time, but the body was never found. Now people began to wonder, could there be a connection? Sleep was almost impossible that night. Every rustling leaf and animal cry had me bolt upright, heart racing. I kept imagining those intelligent, mournful eyes staring at me from the darkness beyond our camp. The next morning, my father and the other men were determined to make another attempt at tracking the creature. This time, I refused to be left behind. After much arguing, my father reluctantly agreed to let me come, as long as I stayed close to him at all times. We set out at dawn, following the trail from the day before. The forest seemed even more oppressive and foreboding now. As we pushed deeper into the wilderness, an unnatural silence fell. No birdsong, no insects buzzing, just the sound of our own breathing and footsteps. Suddenly, one of the dogs began to growl, hackles raised. We all froze, rifles at the ready. That's when we heard it. That same blood-curdling shriek from yesterday, but much closer this time. It seemed to come from all around us at once. Panic set in. Men were shouting, dogs barking frantically. I clung to my father's side as chaos erupted. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of a massive, hair-covered form moving with inhuman speed. The hunters fired their rifles, but the creature was too quick. In the confusion, I lost my grip on my father's hand. I stumbled, disoriented, unsure which way to run. That's when I saw it again, much closer this time. Those eyes locked onto mine, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Fear? Sorrow? For a split second, I felt an inexplicable urge to reach out to it. But then another shot rang out, and the spell was broken. The creature let out a roar of pain and anger before crashing away through the underbrush. I stood there, rooted to the spot, until my father's strong hands gripped my shoulders and shook me out of my daze. The rest of that day is a blur in my memory. The hunters searched for hours, but found no further sign of the creature. There were a few drops of blood where it had last been seen, proving it had been hit, but the trail quickly went cold. We left the island the next day. My father was silent and brooding on the journey home. That night, I overheard him and my mother talking in hushed, worried tones. He spoke of the intelligence in the creature's eyes, how it moved with purpose rather than animal instinct. And he wondered aloud about that old story of the missing child. In the years since, I've tried to make sense of what happened that day. I've read every account I could find of similar creatures, searched for any news of further sightings on Manitu Island. But that encounter remains a mystery that has haunted me for half a century. Sometimes in my dreams, I still see those eyes staring at me from the forest. Eyes that seem to hold secrets, a history, perhaps even a tragic past. Was it truly just an unknown animal, or could it have been something more, a lost soul trapped between two worlds? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know that my experience on Manitu Island changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, and it left me with a lingering sense of sadness for that creature, whatever it was, alone in the wilderness, fleeing from those who would harm it. To this day, I can't look at the forests around Lake Michigan without wondering, is it still out there? And will anyone ever unlock the mystery of the wild man of Manitu Island? Story 4. I was just a young man when I first heard the whispers about Mount St. Helens. The old-timers in my village spoke of it in hushed tones, warning us never to venture near that cursed place. They called it the realm of the skookums, savage, man-eating beasts that stalked the forests and caverns of the mountain. As a headstrong youth of 19, I scoffed at their superstitions. Surely these were just stories meant to frighten children and keep us from exploring beyond our lands. When the white explorer Paul Kane came through our village offering a hefty reward for a native guide to take him to Mount St. Helens, I saw my chance for adventure and riches. Despite the protests of the elders, I volunteered. Kane seemed pleased to have found a willing guide, though I could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes when he realized how young I was. Still, no one else had stepped forward, so he had little choice. We set out at dawn the next morning, Kane, myself, and 2 of his companions, a grizzled trapper named John, and a bookish surveyor called William. The journey started pleasantly enough. The weather was fair, and the forest lush and green as we made our way towards the looming silhouette of the mountain. Kane peppered me with questions about the legends of the skookums, but I had little to tell him beyond vague stories passed down through generations. As we drew closer to our destination, however, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence broken only by our footsteps and the occasional snapping twig. I tried to shake off my growing sense of dread, telling myself I was just letting the old stories get to me. But I couldn't help noticing that even Cain and his men seemed on edge, speaking in hushed voices and constantly scanning the trees around us. As we made camp that night at the base of the mountain, none of us mentioned the palpable tension in the air. We built up the fire higher than usual and took turns keeping watch through the night. I barely slept, starting at every small sound from the darkness beyond our campfire's glow. The next morning dawned grey and misty. We broke camp quickly, eager to begin our ascent of the mountain and be done with this unsettling place. As we climbed higher, the mist thickened into a soupy fog that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The silence was absolute now, broken only by our labored breathing as we navigated the steep, rocky terrain. It was nearing midday when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We froze, straining our eyes to pierce the fog around us. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then another growl, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Panic gripped me as I realized the old stories were true. The skookums were real, and they had found us. Cain barked orders for us to form a tight circle, backs to each other. I could hear the fear in his voice, all his bravado gone. We drew our weapons, Cain and John with their rifles, William with a revolver, and myself with only a hunting knife. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. A massive shape burst from the fog, all matted fur and razor claws. It bowled into William before any of us could react, bearing him to the ground with a sickening crunch. His screams were cut short as the beast tore into him with frightening savagery. Cain and John opened fire, the thunderous reports of their rifles momentarily drowning out the wet, ripping sounds of William being devoured. I stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed with terror. Through the thinning gun smoke, I caught glimpses of our attacker, far larger than a man, with a sloped ape-like face and eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence. More shapes emerged from the fog. 4 more of the creatures. They moved with terrifying speed for their size, darting in and out of view. John went down next, a skookum's massive hand closing around his head and twisting with sickening force. Cain kept firing, but for every beast he dropped, 2 more seemed to take its place. I don't know what finally snapped me out of my daze. Perhaps some primal survival instinct kicking in. But suddenly I was running, crashing blindly through the underbrush. Behind me, I heard Cain's screams abruptly silenced, followed by the triumphant howls of the skookums. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, stumbling and falling over rocks and roots, scratched and bleeding from 100 small cuts. Still, I pushed on, driven by pure terror. I had no idea which direction I was going, only that I had to get as far away from that hellish mountain as possible. As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion set in. My legs felt like lead, each step an enormous effort. The fog had thinned somewhat, but I was hopelessly lost in terrain I didn't recognize. Just as I was about to collapse, I burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a sight that stopped me in my tracks. It was a crude structure of some kind, a circle of tall stones surrounding a raised stone platform. The stones were covered in strange carvings and symbols I didn't recognize. Despite my fear and exhaustion, I felt drawn to investigate. As I approached the stone circle, the air seemed to grow thick and heavy. My head swam, and for a moment I thought I saw shadowy figures moving between the stones. I shook my head to clear it, and the visions vanished. But the oppressive feeling remained. I was about to turn and flee when something on the central platform caught my eye. Lying there, partially covered by leaves and debris, was a small object. With trembling hands, I brushed away the detritus to reveal a smooth stone disc, about the size of my palm. It was inscribed with the same bizarre symbols I'd seen on the standing stones. Without really knowing why, I pocketed the disc. As soon as I did, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the forest behind me. The skookums had picked up my trail. Panic gave me a fresh burst of energy, and I sprinted away from the stone circle as fast as my battered body would allow. The rest of that day passed in a blur of terror and exhaustion. I ran until I could run no more, then stumbled on in a daze. Miraculously, I somehow found my way back to familiar territory as night was falling. I staggered into my village, babbling incoherently about monsters and death. For days afterward, I was in a state of shock, barely able to speak. When I finally told my story, few believed me. They said I must have gotten lost and imagined it all in my panic. But I know what I saw. The skookums are real, and they guard Mount St. Helens zealously against intruders. It's been years now, but I still have nightmares about that day. I wake up in a cold sweat, the howls of the skookums echoing in my mind. And always, there's the weight of that strange stone disc in my pocket, a tangible reminder that what I experienced was all too real. I've thought about trying to return, to find that clearing with the stone circle again, to unravel the mystery of the disc and the creatures that lurk on Mount St. Helens. But then I remember the terror of that day, the brutal deaths of Cain and his men, and I know that some secrets are best left buried. So I stay far away from the mountain, and I warn others to do the same. The skookums are out there waiting, and they're hungry. Story 5. It's been years, but I still can't shake the memory of that bizarre encounter. I've debated sharing this story countless times, always hesitating out of fear of ridicule, but I can no longer keep it to myself. Perhaps writing it down will help me make sense of what happened that day on the island. I was stationed on a small, remote island off the coast of India in 1852 as part of my work with the East India Company. It was a lonely post, just me and a handful of other British merchants and administrators, along with the native islanders. Our days mostly consisted of paperwork, trade negotiations, and staring out at the endless expanse of the Indian Ocean. One sweltering afternoon in late August, I was sitting at my desk in the small bungalow that served as both my office and living quarters. Sweat trickled down my back as I worked on tedious inventory reports. The only sounds were the scratching of my pen and the steady drone of insects outside. Suddenly, I heard a loud thump on the wooden porch that wrapped around the bungalow. Probably just a falling branch, I thought. But then came another thump, followed by what sounded like heavy footsteps. My heart began to race. We sometimes had issues with large monitor lizards wandering onto the porches, but this sounded much bigger. A tiger, perhaps. There had been rumors of a man-eater on a neighboring island. I stood up slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. Part of me wanted to barricade the door and hide, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept towards the entrance, grabbing a fireplace poker as I went, a pitiful weapon, but better than nothing. With trembling hands, I grasped the doorknob and slowly turned it. I cracked the door open just an inch, peering out into the blinding sunlight. What I saw nearly made my heart stop. There, not 5 feet away, was an enormous orangutan. But this was no ordinary ape. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with rusty red fur and a face so dark it was almost black. Most shockingly, it had an enormous white beard that flowed down its chest. The creature was sitting in one of the wicker chairs on my porch, as casually as you please, and in its massive hands was a book. One of my books that I'd left outside. The orangutan appeared to be carefully turning the pages, examining each one with what looked like genuine interest. I stood frozen, unable to breathe. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. This had to be a hallucination brought on by the heat. There was no way this was real. But then the ape looked up, and our eyes met. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this was no ordinary animal. There was an unmistakable spark of intelligence in those eyes, a self-awareness that sent chills down my spine. For several agonizing seconds, we just stared at each other. I felt like a mouse hypnotized by a cobra. Then, ever so slowly, I began to open the door wider. That broke the spell. The orangutan's lips peeled back, revealing yellowed fangs. It let out a guttural hiss and spat at me, spraying saliva. I stumbled backwards with a yelp, falling to the floor. By the time I scrambled back to my feet, the creature was gone. I rushed out onto the porch, just in time to see a flash of red fur disappearing into the thick jungle that bordered my yard. The foliage shook violently as the ape swung through the treetops with astonishing speed and agility. Within seconds, it had vanished completely, leaving no trace but the book lying open on the chair. I stood there panting, my legs shaking so badly I had to grip the porch railing for support. What in God's name had I just witnessed? The rest of that day passed in a daze. I wandered around in a stupor, jumping at every sound. I kept expecting the orangutan to come crashing back out of the jungle at any moment. But the hours ticked by, and nothing happened. That evening, I finally worked up the courage to tell one of my colleagues what I'd seen. He listened with growing skepticism, then burst out laughing when I finished. "An orangutan reading a book. Come now, old chap. I think you've been out in the sun too long. Perhaps you dozed off and had a vivid dream." But I knew it wasn't a dream. The image of those intelligent eyes boring into mine was seared into my memory. No dream could produce such a visceral feeling of connection, of mutual recognition between two conscious minds. Over the next few days, I scoured the jungle surrounding my bungalow, searching for any sign of the creature. But I found nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no tufts of red fur. It was as if the ape had simply materialized out of thin air, then vanished back into nothingness. I questioned some of the native islanders, showing them rough sketches I'd made of the orangutan. Most just shrugged or shook their heads, but one elderly man's eyes widened when he saw the drawing. He muttered something in his local dialect that I couldn't understand, then hurried away, refusing to speak to me further. Weeks passed, then months. Life on the island returned to its usual monotonous routine, but I remained on edge, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes at night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd heard heavy breathing outside my window. But when I looked, there was never anything there. As time went on, I began to doubt my own memory of that day. Had the orangutan really been that large? Had it actually been reading, or just idly flipping pages? Maybe my colleague was right. Perhaps it had all been some kind of heat-induced hallucination. But then, about 6 months after the incident, something happened that erased all doubt from my mind. I was walking along the beach one evening, watching the sun sink into the ocean. Lost in thought, I didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows of a grove of palm trees until I was only yards away. I stopped short, my blood turning to ice. It was the orangutan. This time, there was no mistaking its massive size. It towered over me, its white beard glowing in the fading sunlight, those piercing eyes fixed on me once again. But this time, the ape made no move to flee. Instead, it slowly extended one enormous hand. Clutched in its leathery fingers was a scrap of paper. Trembling, I reached out and took it. The orangutan immediately turned and loped off down the beach, quickly disappearing around a bend. I looked down at the paper in my shaking hands. On it was a crude drawing of what appeared to be a map. I recognized the outline of the island, with an X marked in a remote area of the interior that I'd never explored. Below the drawing were 3 words, written in a shaky but unmistakably human hand. "Find me, help." I stood there for a long time, staring at those words as the last light faded from the sky. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Who or what was this creature? How had it learned to write? And what kind of help could it possibly need from me? Part of me wanted to burn the paper and forget this madness, to go back to my safe, orderly life and pretend none of this had ever happened. But I knew I couldn't do that. Whatever this being was, it had reached out to me, chosen me for something. I couldn't turn my back on that. The next morning I packed a bag with supplies and set out into the jungle, following the crude map. What I found in those remote mountains defied all logic and reason. But that, I'm afraid, is a story for another time. Even now, years later, I'm not sure I fully understand what happened on that island. Was it all an elaborate hoax, some kind of shared delusion, or had I stumbled upon something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world? All I know is that my encounter with that strange, intelligent creature changed me forever. It opened my eyes to possibilities I never could have imagined, and it left me with a mystery that I fear will haunt me for the rest of my days. Story 6. I still remember that day in Spokane like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 180 years. The year was 1840, and I was just a young trapper working with the local native tribes to gather furs and fish. We had a good system going. They'd teach me their ways and share their knowledge of the land, and I'd trade them goods from the settlements. But something wasn't right that summer. The natives were on edge, jumpy at every little sound in the forest. At first I thought maybe there was tension between tribes that I didn't know about, but then they started telling me about these creatures. Big, stink bad, one of the elders told me in broken English, wrinkling his nose. He held his hand high above his head. Tall like tree, take fish from nets. I laughed it off at first, probably just some bears getting bold, I figured. But the fear in their eyes made me uneasy. These were skilled hunters and trackers who knew the land intimately. If something had them spooked, it was worth paying attention to. One muggy afternoon in late July, I was checking fish nets with 2 of the younger native men. I think their names were something like Ahanu and Cheveo, though my memory isn't what it used to be. The air was thick and still, hardly a breeze stirring the pines. Sweat trickled down my back as we pulled in the day's catch. That's when I noticed the smell. At first I thought maybe one of the fish had started to rot in the heat, but this was different. A rank, musky odor that made my eyes water. I gagged and covered my nose with my sleeve. "You smell that?" I asked the others. They both tensed up immediately, eyes going wide as they scanned the tree line. Without a word, Ahanu grabbed my arm and started pulling me towards the canoe. "Wait, what's going on?" I protested, stumbling as he dragged me along. "What is that smell?" "Shh," Cheveo hissed, frantically gathering up our gear. "We go, now." That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever encountered before. My blood ran cold as I realized this must be the creature they'd been warning me about. We scrambled into the canoe, nearly tipping it in our haste. As we pushed off from shore, I caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. Something massive and dark, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. The stench grew stronger, and I fought the urge to vomit. We paddled furiously, not daring to look back until we were well out into the open water. When I finally turned, my jaw dropped. There on the shore stood not 1, but 3 of the most terrifying beings I'd ever laid eyes on. They were vaguely man-shaped, but covered in thick, matted fur. Their arms hung long at their sides, massive hands nearly brushing the ground. But it was their faces that haunted me. A bizarre mix of ape and human features with deep-set eyes that gleamed with unsettling intelligence. For a moment, we all just stared at each other across the water. Then, one of the creatures let out a bone-chilling roar that echoed across the lake. Without hesitation, we turned and paddled for our lives. Back at the village, no one seemed surprised by our story. If anything, they were relieved we'd made it back in one piece. Over the next few weeks, the sightings and encounters only increased. Fish vanished from nets. Strange tracks appeared around the outskirts of the camp, huge bare footprints, easily 18 inches long, and always that horrible smell lingered. It got to where you could taste it in the air, this thick miasma of musk and rot that never fully dissipated. Sleep became almost impossible. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had us on high alert. The tribe's shaman attempted rituals to ward off the creatures, but nothing seemed to work. A group of warriors tried to track them back to wherever they were coming from, but returned shaken and empty-handed. It was like the things appeared and vanished at will, leaving only destruction and that god-awful stench in their wake. I'll never forget the night of the full moon in August. The air was electric with tension as we huddled around the fires, weapons close at hand. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the children seemed to sense the wrongness in the air. Just after midnight, a blood-curdling scream split the night. We all leapt to our feet as one of the younger women came tearing into the camp, her eyes wild with terror. "They took him!" she wailed, collapsing to her knees. "The monsters! They took my son!" Chaos erupted as warriors grabbed weapons and torches, preparing to head into the forest. I found myself swept up in the frenzy, clutching my old rifle with sweating hands as we plunged into the darkness. The stench hit us like a wall as soon as we left the firelight behind. My eyes watered and my stomach churned, but I pressed on. All around us, the forest seemed alive with movement and strange guttural sounds. We hadn't gone more than a quarter mile when an ear-splitting roar stopped us in our tracks. There, in a small clearing, stood one of the creatures, easily 8 feet tall and rippling with muscle beneath its thick fur. In one massive hand, it held the limp form of a small child. Time seemed to stand still as we faced off against this impossible being. Its eyes gleamed in the torchlight, filled with a mixture of rage and something else. Intelligence, fear. To this day, I'm not sure. One of the warriors loosed an arrow, which bounced harmlessly off the creature's broad chest. With a snarl, it turned and loped into the trees, moving with shocking speed for something so large. We gave chase, but it was like trying to follow a ghost. Hours we searched, calling out for the boy and straining our ears for any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing, no tracks, no broken branches, not even that overwhelming stench. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. As dawn broke, we trudged back to camp in defeated silence. The boy's mother's anguished wails echoed through the trees, a sound that still haunts my dreams to this day. Over the next few weeks, the attacks and sightings gradually tapered off. It was as if the creatures had simply vanished back into whatever hell they'd crawled out of. But the fear remained, along with that lingering stink that never fully went away. I left Spokane not long after, the memories too painful to bear. In all my years since, I've never encountered anything like those creatures again. Sometimes I wonder if it was all some sort of mass hysteria brought on by the isolation and harsh conditions. But then I'll catch a whiff of something musky on the wind, or see a shadow move just wrong out of the corner of my eye, and I'm right back there in those woods, face to face with something that shouldn't exist. I don't know what those things were, or where they came from. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Wendigo. The names don't matter. All I know is that they were real, they were terrifying, and they changed me forever. So next time you're out in the wilderness and you catch a strange scent on the breeze, or hear something moving in the underbrush that sounds just a little too big, don't dismiss it. You never know what might be watching from the shadows. Story 7. I've been living in Apalachicola, Florida my whole life, working at the cotton warehouse down by the docks. It's usually a pretty quiet job, load the bales, keep inventory, that sort of thing. But what happened last week? I still can't wrap my head around it. It was a typical humid July morning. I'd gotten to the warehouse early to get a head start on the day's shipments. As I was walking through the stacks of cotton bales, I noticed something odd in one of the back corners. At first I thought maybe some local kids had been messing around, building a fort or something. But as I got closer, I realized this was no child's play fort. There was a strange structure nestled between some of the cotton bales, made of twigs and leaves, and what looked like bits of rope and burlap. It was crudely woven together, but in a deliberate way, like a bird's nest, but much bigger. My skin started to prickle as I approached it. Something about it just felt wrong. That's when I noticed the bones. Scattered around the base of the nest were small animal bones, rabbits, possums, that kind of thing. But mixed in were a few larger bones that made my blood run cold. They looked disturbingly human-like. I must have made some kind of noise because suddenly there was movement from inside the nest. Before I could react, something burst out of it and rushed past me. I only caught a glimpse, but what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was about 5 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear or any other animal I recognized. It moved in a horrible, loping gait on 2 legs. As it passed, I saw its face for just a split second, a flat, ape-like snout with bared teeth and eyes that were far too intelligent. I yelled and stumbled backwards, knocking over a stack of cotton bales. By the time I got to my feet, the thing was gone. I could hear it crashing through the warehouse, knocking things over as it fled. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the lock, but I managed to get out of there and run to the sheriff's office. I must have sounded like a madman, babbling about monster nests and ape creatures. Sheriff Taylor clearly thought I'd been drinking, but he agreed to come take a look. When we got back to the warehouse, the nest was still there. The sheriff's face went pale when he saw the bones. He started taking it a lot more seriously after that. We searched the whole building but found no sign of the creature. It was just gone. Word spread quickly through town. Some folks thought it must have been an escaped circus animal or maybe a deformed bear. Others whispered about darker things, monsters from Indian legends or demons come to punish us for our sins. A few of the men organized hunting parties to search the woods, but they never found anything. As the days passed with no further sightings, people started to relax. Maybe it had just been a one-time thing, they said. The creature had moved on, but I knew better. Late at night, when the town was quiet, I could sometimes hear strange noises from the woods. Howls that didn't sound quite animal, branches breaking under heavy footsteps. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of the trees, a dark shape watching me with those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. I don't go to the warehouse alone anymore. I keep my doors locked at night and a loaded gun by my bed, because I know it's still out there somewhere, waiting, watching, and sooner or later, it's going to come back. The incident at the warehouse happened over a week ago now, but I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every little noise makes me jump. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that horrible ape-like face leering at me from the shadows. I've tried talking to some of the other folks in town about it, but most of them have already moved on. They think it was just some kind of wild animal that's long gone by now, but they didn't see what I saw. They didn't look into those eyes. Yesterday, I noticed some strange tracks in the mud down by the river. They looked almost like bare human footprints, but longer and wider, with claw marks at the tips of the toes. I showed them to Sheriff Taylor, but he just shook his head and told me I was getting paranoid. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am letting my imagination run wild. But I can't shake the feeling that we're all in danger. That thing, whatever it was intelligent. It had built that nest, collected those bones. It wasn't just some dumb animal. I've been doing some research, trying to figure out what it could have been. I found some old Indian legends about a creature called the skunk ape that's supposed to live in the swamps of Florida. Some of the descriptions match what I saw. But those are just stories, right? They can't be real. Last night, I woke up to a sound outside my window. It was a low, guttural huffing noise, almost like laughter. By the time I worked up the courage to look outside, whatever made the sound was gone. But there were scratch marks on the windowsill that weren't there before. I'm writing all this down because I need someone to believe me. I need someone to understand what's happening here. That thing in the warehouse wasn't natural. It doesn't belong in this world. And I'm terrified of what might happen if it decides to come back into town. The cotton warehouse has been closed since the incident. No one wants to work there anymore. I drive by it sometimes and I swear I can see movement inside, shadows shifting in ways they shouldn't. But when I blink, it's gone. I've started having nightmares. In them, I'm back in the warehouse, but this time I can't escape. That creature is there, always just out of sight. I can hear it moving, smell its musty animal odor, and then suddenly it's right in front of me, those intelligent eyes boring into mine as it reaches for me with long, hairy arms. I wake up in a cold sweat every time, heart pounding like it's trying to burst out of my chest. I'm barely sleeping anymore. The lack of rest is starting to take its toll. I'm jumpy, irritable. People are starting to give me strange looks around town. But how can I relax when I know that thing is out there? How can I sleep when every night I imagine it creeping closer to my home, to the people I care about? I've started carrying a gun with me everywhere I go. It probably won't do much good against that creature, but it makes me feel a little safer, a little less helpless. Sometimes I think about leaving town, just packing up and heading somewhere far away. But then I remember those eyes, that intelligence, and I know that no matter where I go, it would find me. It's like it's inside my head now, a constant presence that I can't escape. So I stay, I watch, and I wait. Because I know that sooner or later, it's going to show itself again. And when it does, I'll be ready. I have to be. For my sake, and for the sake of everyone in this town. I just hope I'm not too late when the time comes. That thing in the warehouse was just the beginning. I can feel it in my bones. Something is coming. Something big. And God help us all when it arrives. Story 8. I'll never forget that day at Cunningham's Creek. It was 1848, and I'd been working as a shepherd for W. Sutton for a few months. The Australian bush was still new to me, full of strange sights and sounds, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that afternoon. The day started like any other. I woke before dawn, had a quick breakfast of damper and tea, then headed out with the sheep and dogs. We had 6 working dogs, tough, seasoned animals that feared nothing. They'd take on wild dingoes without hesitation to protect the flock. As the morning wore on, the heat became oppressive. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of eucalyptus. The sheep were restless, clustering together and bleating more than usual. I figured they were just bothered by the heat and flies, but looking back, I wonder if they sensed something. It was about midday when I first noticed the dogs acting strangely. They kept looking towards a dense patch of scrub, ears pricked and hackles raised. I peered in that direction, but couldn't see anything unusual, just tangled vegetation and shadows. I whistled for the dogs to keep moving, but they were reluctant. That should have been my first warning. Those dogs lived to work. I'd never seen them hesitate to follow a command before. As we approached a small creek, I decided to let the sheep drink and rest in the shade for a bit. I found a spot to sit and pulled out my water skin, grateful for a chance to cool off. The dogs paced restlessly instead of flopping down in the shade like they normally would. That's when I heard it. A deep, rumbling sound, unlike anything I'd encountered before. It wasn't quite a growl, more like a cross between a lion's roar and a man clearing his throat. The sheep huddled together, bleating in alarm. I stood up slowly, scanning the area. The sound seemed to be coming from a thicket about 50 yards away. As I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, something moved. At first, I thought it was a man. The figure was tall, well over 6 feet, and walked on 2 legs. But as it emerged from the shadows, I realized with growing horror that this was no human. Its body was covered in thick, matted hair. Not fur like an animal, but long hair more like a man's beard grown wild. The face was flat and brutal, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with unmistakable intelligence. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging nearly to its knees. I stood, frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. My mind kept trying to rationalize it. A very hairy aborigine, perhaps, or some kind of giant ape that had escaped from a traveling show. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The creature took a step forward, and that's when true panic set in. Not my panic. The dogs. These fearless animals that would battle dingoes and stand their ground against angry bulls suddenly turned tail and ran. They didn't just run, they fled in blind terror, yelping and whimpering with their tails tucked between their legs. Seeing those brave dogs reduced to cowering pups shook me to my core. If they were that afraid, what chance did I have? I'd like to say I stood my ground bravely, but the truth is, I ran too. I abandoned the sheep and sprinted after the dogs, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see gaining on me. I ran until my lungs were on fire, stumbling and gasping. When I finally stopped, sides heaving, I realized I was totally lost. The familiar landmarks were gone, and in my panic, I'd run in a random direction. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of the eerie silence. No bird calls, no insects buzzing, just a heavy, waiting stillness. I turned in a slow circle, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of the creature. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the next few hours trying to find my way back, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. By the time I stumbled into the station yard, the sun was setting. Mr. Sutton came out, his face a mix of anger and concern. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. "And where are my sheep?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I explain what I'd seen? He'd think I was mad or drunk or both. In the end, I mumbled something about getting lost and feeling ill from the heat. Mr. Sutton wasn't happy, but he could see I was in a bad way. He sent me to my bunk with a warning that we'd be having words in the morning. I lay awake all night, replaying the encounter in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hairy, man-like face staring at me from the bushes. I kept hearing phantom noises, footsteps, breathing, that awful rumbling growl. The next morning, Mr. Sutton and some of the other hands rode out to search for the missing sheep. They found them several miles away, huddled in a tight group. Strangely, not a single one was missing or hurt. The dogs were another story. We found them scattered across the property, still skittish and whimpering. It took days before they'd work properly again, and even then, they were never quite the same. They'd bark and growl at shadows, and nothing could convince them to go near that part of Cunningham's Creek again. Mr. Sutton questioned me closely about what had happened. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the full truth, but I did mention seeing a strange, hairy man in the bush. He dismissed it as an aborigine, possibly one I'd never encountered before. But I saw the doubt in his eyes. He knew there was more to the story. In the weeks that followed, I heard whispers from some of the older hands, tales of a hairy giant that roamed the bush, leaving massive footprints and terrifying livestock. They called it the Yahoo, or the Yowie. Most laughed it off as campfire stories, but a few of the old-timers nodded gravely. They'd seen things too, things they couldn't explain. I never saw the creature again, but I never forgot that day either. Sometimes, when the wind blows a certain way, or I catch a whiff of that distinctly Australian bush smell, it all comes rushing back. The matted hair, the intelligent eyes, the sheer wrongness of what I saw. I've tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or an overactive imagination brought on by heat exhaustion. But then I remember the dogs, those brave, loyal animals reduced to trembling, terrified pups in an instant. No hallucination could explain that. Whatever I saw that day at Cunningham's Creek was real, and somewhere out there in the vast Australian wilderness, I believe it's still roaming free, watching, waiting, ready to remind us that there are still mysteries in this world that defy explanation. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Most days I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I know what I saw, and I'll carry that memory to my grave. If you ever find yourself in the Australian bush and feel a prickling sensation on the back of your neck, like you're being watched, well, maybe you are. And maybe, just maybe, you'll catch a glimpse of something that will change everything you thought you knew about the world. Just pray you're faster than your dogs if you do. Story 9. It was early autumn, and I had gone out to explore the swamplands southwest of town. As the new school teacher, I wanted to familiarize myself with the local geography. The air was thick and humid that day, mosquitoes buzzing incessantly around my head as I picked my way through the marshy terrain. I remember pausing to wipe the sweat from my brow, leaning against a gnarled cypress tree. That's when I saw it, a dark shape moving through the mist about 50 yards away. At first I thought it might be a bear, but as I squinted to get a better look, I realized this was something altogether different. The creature was hunched over, its long arms nearly dragging on the ground as it lumbered forward with an unnatural, jerky gait. It was covered in dark greyish fur, matted and tangled with swamp vegetation. But it was the way it moved that really unsettled me, lurching and twitching as if its limbs weren't quite under its control. I stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe as I watched this nightmarish beast. It seemed to be heading in my general direction, though I don't think it had spotted me yet. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away as possible, but a morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. What in God's name was this thing? Suddenly, a twig snapped under my foot. The creature's head whipped around, and I caught a glimpse of gleaming yellow eyes before it bolted. But the way it fled was like nothing I'd ever seen. A frenzied scrambling punctuated by erratic leaps and bounds. It moved with incredible speed despite its awkward motions, quickly vanishing into the swamp's murky depths. My heart was pounding as I stumbled back towards town, constantly looking over my shoulder. I felt like those inhuman eyes were still watching me from the shadows. When I finally made it home, my wife said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd witnessed. I was afraid she'd think I'd gone mad. For weeks afterward, I was plagued by nightmares of that creature pursuing me through an endless swamp. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear its uneven footsteps outside our cabin. During the day, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, jumping at every rustle in the underbrush. I tried to convince myself it had just been a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me in the swamp's eerie atmosphere. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I considered telling the sheriff, but what would I even say? That I'd spotted some kind of monster in the swamp. He'd think I was drunk or delirious from swamp fever. As time passed, The memory of that day began to fade. I threw myself into my work at the schoolhouse, trying to push the incident from my mind. But I never went back to those swamplands again. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I'd find myself straining to hear any odd sounds coming from that direction. It was about a month later when I overheard some of the local trappers talking in hushed tones at the general store. They were describing strange tracks they'd found out in the swamp, huge footprints unlike any animal they knew, with an odd gait that didn't match any normal creature's movements. My blood ran cold as I listened, realizing I wasn't the only one who'd encountered something out there. I wanted to speak up, to share what I'd seen, but fear held me back. What if people thought I was crazy? What if sharing my story only brought more attention to whatever was lurking in those wetlands? So I kept quiet, carrying the secret of what I'd witnessed. As the years went by, other strange stories began to circulate around Eagle. Hunters would come back from the swamp white-faced and shaken, refusing to say what had spooked them. Livestock would sometimes go missing, only for mangled carcasses to turn up days later. Children were warned never to venture into the swamplands alone. I often wondered if I should have spoken up sooner, if I could have prevented whatever horrors may have befallen others who encountered that thing. But even now, decades later, I'm not sure anyone would believe me. Sometimes I think back to that day and wonder if I really saw what I think I saw. But then I remember those alien yellow eyes, that impossible way of moving, and I know it was all too real. I'm an old man now, and Eagle has grown into a proper town. The swamplands have been mostly drained and developed. But sometimes, when the wind blows in from the southwest on a gloomy day, I swear I can still hear the echoes of that creature's uneven footsteps, and I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, lurking in whatever pockets of wilderness remain. I've never told anyone this story before now. Maybe it's the guilt of keeping it secret all these years, or maybe I just need to unburden myself before I pass on. But I feel like I owe it to the people of Eagle to finally share what I saw that day. Perhaps it will bring some closure to the other strange tales that have circulated over the years. To anyone reading this, especially those living near Eagle, be careful if you venture into the wild places. There are things out there that defy explanation, things that have no place in our understanding of the natural world. I pray you never encounter what I did, but if you do, know that you're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, speaking up about it can help prevent others from suffering the same terror that's haunted me all these years. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that day in the Eagle Swamp, and no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the sight of that grotesque, lumbering form disappearing into the mist. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some terrors, no matter how deeply buried, never truly fade away. Story 10. I still remember that day in the summer of 1914 like it was yesterday. I was a young anthropologist, fresh out of university, and eager to make a name for myself in the field. My professor had arranged for me to accompany Lieutenant G.T. Evans on an expedition to British Columbia to collect artifacts from the indigenous Niska people along the Nass River. We had been in the region for several weeks, carefully documenting and collecting various ceremonial items with the permission of the tribal elders. It was fascinating work, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered on that fateful afternoon. We were visiting a small, remote village nestled deep in the misty forests. As we spoke with the village chief through our interpreter, my eyes were drawn to an odd mask hanging on the wall of his longhouse. Unlike the other colorful, intricately carved masks depicting animals like eagles and wolves, this one was eerily different. The mask appeared ancient, its wood darkened with age. But what struck me most was that it clearly depicted some kind of ape or monkey-like creature. The elongated face, prominent brow and wide, expressive mouth were unmistakably primate. Yet there were no primates native to this region. The nearest populations were thousands of miles away in Central America. When I inquired about it, the chief's demeanor changed. He became serious, almost grave, as he explained through the interpreter that the mask represented a sacred being from their legends, the Sasquatch, or wild man of the woods. According to their oral history, this creature had inhabited the deep forests since time immemorial. The mask itself was said to be hundreds of years old, passed down through generations of shamans. It was used in secretive rituals to commune with the spirit of the forest and gain protection for hunters venturing into Sasquatch territory. As an academic, my initial reaction was skepticism. Surely this was just a folk tale, perhaps inspired by traders' stories of apes from distant lands. But the genuine fear and reverence in the chief's eyes gave me pause. These were not simple, superstitious people. They had intimate knowledge of the land and its creatures, built up over thousands of years. Lieutenant Evans was equally intrigued. He began negotiations to purchase the mask for the museum collection, but the chief was extremely reluctant to part with such a sacred item. It took days of discussion and promises of other valuable trade goods before he finally agreed. That night, as we carefully packed the mask for transport, an unsettling feeling came over me. The dark, hollow eyes of the mask seemed to follow my movements. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if we were disturbing something that should have been left alone. Our unease only grew as we began our journey back to the coast the next morning. The warm, sunny weather we'd enjoyed for weeks suddenly turned cold and foggy. An oppressive silence fell over the forest. No birds sang, no insects chirped. Even our native guides seemed on edge, constantly scanning the misty trees around us. As we made camp that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I tried to dismiss it as an overactive imagination, fueled by the eerie mask and the native stories. But in the middle of the night, I bolted awake to the sound of heavy footsteps circling our camp. My heart pounding, I peered out of my tent. Through the thick fog, I caught glimpses of a massive, dark shape moving just beyond the firelight. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, easily 8 feet tall, with long arms and a powerful ape-like build. But it moved with an intelligence and purpose that no mere animal could possess. I wanted to cry out, to wake the others, but terror froze my voice in my throat. For what felt like an eternity, the creature circled us, as if studying our camp. Then, with a hair-raising howl that echoed through the mountains, it melted back into the mist. I lay there shaking until dawn, convinced I would be torn from my tent at any moment. When I finally emerged, ashen-faced in the grey morning light, I found the rest of our party in similar states of shock. Our guides were huddled together, muttering prayers in their native tongue. Lieutenant Evans tried to maintain a rational demeanor, suggesting it was just a bear or perhaps wolves. But the tracks we found in the soft earth told a different story. Huge, human-like footprints over 15 inches long. What followed was the most terrifying trek of my life. We abandoned most of our equipment, carrying only the mask and essential supplies, as we rushed headlong through the wilderness. More than once we heard that bone-chilling howl echoing in the distance. Glimpses of dark shapes flitting between trees kept us constantly on edge. It wasn't until we reached the safety of Fort Simpson that we finally began to relax. But even then, none of us could quite shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into something beyond our understanding. In his official report, Evans downplayed the more fantastical elements of our expedition. The mask was dutifully catalogued and shipped off to a museum. On paper, it was just another successful collecting trip. But I knew the truth. In the years since, I've dedicated my career to studying the legends and artifacts related to the Sasquatch. I've heard countless similar encounters from both natives and settlers across the Pacific Northwest. And every time I close my eyes, I can still see that massive, shadowy figure circling our camp, a primal intelligence burning in its eyes. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I can barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw out there in those mist-shrouded forests. And I'll never forget the night I came face to face with a legend. Story 11. I was a young mother living in the remote steppes of Mongolia back in 1859. Life was simple but harsh out there. Just me, my husband, and our baby boy in our small yurt, tending to our livestock and trying to survive the brutal winters. That spring day started like any other. I woke up at dawn to milk the goats and prepare breakfast while my husband went out to check on the horses. Our 6-month-old son was still sleeping soundly in his crib. After finishing my morning chores, I realized we were running low on water. The nearest stream was about a 20-minute walk away, so I decided to make a quick trip to refill our water skins. I bundled up the baby and strapped him to my back, as I always did when leaving the yurt. The morning air was crisp, and I could see my breath as I walked briskly towards the stream. When I arrived, I gently laid the baby down on a soft patch of grass nearby while I filled the water skins. He was cooing happily, enjoying the fresh air and sunshine. As I was finishing up, I heard a strange rustling sound coming from the bushes behind me. I quickly spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, an uneasy feeling came over me. I hurriedly gathered up the full water skins and went to pick up my son, eager to get back home. But when I reached the spot where I had laid him down, he was gone. Panic seized me instantly. I called out for him frantically, searching the surrounding area in a frenzy. How could he have disappeared in just a few short minutes? He wasn't even crawling yet. Horrible scenarios flashed through my mind. Had a wolf or eagle snatched him away? Just as I was about to run back to the yurt to get help, I heard a faint cry coming from further down the stream. Relief flooded through me as I raced towards the sound, but what I saw when I rounded the bend of the stream stopped me dead in my tracks. There, crouched by the water's edge, was the most terrifying creature I had ever laid eyes on. It appeared to be a woman, but unlike any woman I'd ever seen. She was completely naked, her body covered in thick, matted hair from head to toe. Her face was barely visible beneath the tangle of hair, but I could make out wild, feral eyes and sharp, yellowed teeth. And there in her arms was my baby boy. I stood frozen in shock and horror as I realized what was happening. This beast was holding my son to her breast, attempting to nurse him. The baby seemed bewildered but wasn't crying, perhaps soothed by the warmth of her body. A guttural scream tore from my throat before I could stop it. The creature's head snapped up at the sound, her eyes locking with mine. For a split second we just stared at each other. I saw something almost human flicker in her gaze, fear, confusion, maybe even a hint of shame. Then, moving with inhuman speed, she gently placed my son on the ground and bolted into the forest. I rushed forward and scooped up my baby, sobbing with relief as I clutched him to my chest. He started to cry, probably frightened by my own cries and the creature's sudden movements. I ran all the way back to our yurt, not daring to look behind me. When I burst through the door, my husband was just returning from tending the horses. He was alarmed by my hysterical state, and it took several minutes for me to calm down enough to explain what had happened. At first, he was skeptical of my wild tale, but as we examined our son, we found long, coarse hairs clinging to his clothing and skin, hairs that were not human or from any animal we knew. And there on his chest was a faint red mark, as if he had been suckled by something with much stronger suction than a human infant. We debated whether to tell others in our small nomadic community about what had happened. Part of me was desperate to warn them of the danger lurking in the wilderness. but I also feared they would think I was crazy or lying. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves, but we became much more vigilant about never leaving our son unattended, even for a moment. In the weeks and months that followed, I was constantly on edge. Every rustle in the grass, every shadow at dusk made me jump. I kept replaying that awful scene in my mind, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't returned when I did. Would that creature have taken my baby away forever? But as time passed and we saw no further sign of the hair-covered woman, life gradually returned to normal. We never spoke of the incident again, but I know my husband believed me. How could he not, with the physical evidence we had seen on our son? Years later, when my son was grown, I finally worked up the courage to tell him about that day by the stream. He was fascinated and pressed me for every detail I could remember. As we talked, a thought occurred to me that I had never considered before. What if that creature had once been a human woman? What if she had somehow gotten lost or stranded in the wilderness as a child, forced to survive on her own until she became more animal than human? And when she came across my crying, helpless baby, did some long-buried maternal instinct awaken in her? I'll never know the truth about what I saw that day. But sometimes I wonder, if things had gone differently in my own life, could I have become like her? A wild woman of the steppes, desperate for any scrap of human connection. The encounter lasted only moments, but it has haunted me for a lifetime. Even now, as an old woman, I sometimes wake in the night thinking I hear that creature's inhuman keening on the wind, and I pull the blankets tighter, grateful for the warmth and safety of human companionship, yet unable to forget that there are still mysteries in this world beyond our understanding. Story 12. It was early October, and I'd set up camp near a small lake, hoping to catch some beaver and maybe a few marten before the winter set in. The air was crisp, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I remember thinking how peaceful it all was as I sat by my fire, sipping some coffee and planning my trap lines for the next day. As the sun started to set, I noticed something odd. The woods had gone quiet. Now I'm used to the sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small critters in the underbrush. But this was different. It was like every living thing was holding its breath. I stood up, my hand instinctively going to the knife at my belt. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear. We get plenty of those up here, and I've had my fair share of run-ins. But as I squinted into the gathering darkness, I realized this was no bear. It was walking on two legs, for one thing, and it was tall, taller than any man I've ever seen. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. The creature was covered in thick, dark hair from head to toe. Its arms were long, almost reaching its knees, and its hands... God, its hands were massive. It stepped closer to my camp, and I could see its face now. It had deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the firelight, and a broad, flat nose. Its mouth was set in a grimace, revealing teeth that looked sharp enough to tear through bone. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few seconds. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and loped off into the woods, moving faster than anything that size had any right to. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I kept my rifle close and my fire burning bright, jumping at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before and hightailed it out of there. I thought that would be the end of it, that I'd had my brush with, whatever it was, and that would be that. But I was wrong. A few days later, I was checking my traps near the lake when I saw it again. It was standing on a rocky outcropping on a small island in the middle of the lake. Even from a distance, I could tell it was the same creature. It was just watching me. I dropped everything and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my lungs burning and my legs feeling like jelly. When I finally caught my breath, I started asking around, trying to see if anyone else had seen anything like what I'd encountered. That's when I first heard the name Pamela. The old-timers in town called it the demon of the woods. They spoke about it in hushed tones, like they were afraid it might hear them and come looking. Some of them had stories of their own, glimpses of a hairy figure in the forest, strange howls in the night, massive footprints found in the mud. I've been back to Mount Katahdin since then. Had to, really. It's where the best trapping is. But I never go alone anymore, and I always keep one eye on the tree line. Sometimes when the wind is right, I swear I can hear something moving through the forest, something big. And sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of a tall, hairy figure watching me from the shadows. I don't know what Pamela is. Some folks say it's a monster, others say it's a spirit. All I know is that it's out there, and it's real. And if you ever find yourself in the wilds of Maine, keep your wits about you, because you never know when you might come face to face with the demon of the woods. I've tried to make sense of it all in the years since. I've read every book I could find on local legends, talked to every old-timer who'd listen. But the more I learn, the more questions I have. Some say Pamela has been around since before the first settlers came to these parts. There are stories of Native American tribes who avoided certain areas of the mountain, speaking of a powerful spirit that guarded the wilderness. Others claim it's some kind of animal, maybe a relic from prehistoric times that somehow survived in the remote corners of the forest. I've heard tales of hunters going missing, of strange sounds echoing through the valleys at night, of massive human-like footprints found in places where no human could possibly reach. And every time I hear one of these stories, I'm right back there by that lake, staring into those glowing eyes. The encounter changed me, I won't lie. I used to love the solitude of the forest, the quiet beauty of the wilderness. Now, every snapping twig makes me jump, every shadow seems to hide something sinister. I still trap, it's in my blood after all, but I'm always on edge, always watching. There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of that creature's face vivid in my mind. I can still smell the musty animal odor that hung around it, still feel the primal fear that gripped me when I realized what I was looking at. I've tried to talk to the authorities about it, but they just laugh it off. Another Bigfoot sighting, they say, rolling their eyes. But this wasn't like the stories you hear from other parts of the country. This was something different, something older. The locals, though, they believe, especially the ones who've been here for generations. They've all got their own Pamela stories, passed down from their grandparents and great-grandparents. They talk about offerings left in the woods to appease the creature, about areas of the mountain that are strictly off-limits. I've seen things since that first encounter, too. Glimpses of a large, hair-covered form moving through the trees. Strange tracks in the snow that don't match any animal I know. Once, I even found one of my traps twisted and mangled like it was made of paper, not steel. There are times when I think about leaving, about moving somewhere where the forests aren't so deep and the mountains aren't so high. But this is my home. And despite everything, I can't bring myself to go. Besides, a part of me feels like I need to stay, to warn others, to try and understand what's out there. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days when I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. Pamela, the demon of the woods, is real. And it's out there, watching, waiting. So if you ever find yourself in the wilds of Maine, if you ever decide to hike Mount Katahdin or camp by one of our 1,000 lakes, remember my story. Keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know when you might come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that defies explanation. And if you hear the woods go quiet, if you feel eyes on you from the darkness, don't hesitate. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because Pamela is real, and it's not just a legend. It's out there, in the heart of the Maine wilderness, and it's watching, always watching. Story 13. I grew up on a small farm in Arkansas in the mid-1800s. Life was simple but good. We worked hard, but always had enough to eat and a warm place to sleep. That all changed one summer evening in 1850 when I was 17 years old. I was out checking on our cattle herd as the sun was setting. It was a beautiful, peaceful evening, and I remember feeling content as I rode my horse along the edge of the pasture. Suddenly, the cattle started acting strange. They were restless, mooing loudly, and bunching together nervously. I figured maybe a coyote or mountain lion was nearby spooking them. As I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of a predator, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was what looked like a man, but not quite. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in thick, matted hair from head to toe. The face was flat and ape-like, with deep-set eyes that glowed eerily in the fading light. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in shock and terror. Then it let out a bone-chilling roar and charged towards the herd. I've never seen anything move so fast. It covered the 50 yards to the nearest cow in just a few massive bounds, leaping 12-15 feet with each stride. The cattle panicked and scattered. I snapped out of my daze and spurred my horse into action, racing towards the herd to try to keep them together. The beast effortlessly caught up to a young calf that had gotten separated. With terrifying strength, it grabbed the 200-pound calf around the middle and tossed it over its shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. I yelled and waved my arms, trying to scare it off. For a moment it turned and looked right at me. Those eyes, I'll never forget them. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either. There was an intelligence there, but also a savage, primal hunger that chilled me to my core. The thing started to lope off towards the woods with its prey. Foolishly, I urged my horse to give chase. We were no match for its speed. It effortlessly bounded away, clearing small trees and bushes with 12-foot leaps. Just before it disappeared into the thick forest, it turned back and let out another ear-splitting roar that echoed across the valley. Then it was gone. I sat there on my horse, shaking and trying to process what I'd just seen. It felt like a nightmare, but the spooked cattle and drag marks on the ground where it had grabbed the calf were all too real. I noticed some strange tracks in the mud and dismounted to take a closer look. The footprints were huge, easily 13 inches long. They were vaguely human-shaped, but with massive claw-like toes. I raced back to the farmhouse to tell my pa what had happened. He could see I was badly shaken up. When I described the creature, his face went pale. He'd heard whispered stories from the local Cherokee about giant hair-covered wild men in the mountains, but had always dismissed them as superstition. Now he wasn't so sure. Word spread quickly among the neighboring farms. Some were skeptical at first, but that changed when 2 more calves went missing over the next week. Others started to report sightings, fleeting glimpses of a huge hair-covered shape moving through the woods with unnatural speed and agility. Nights became tense affairs. We started bringing the livestock into the barns and keeping loaded rifles close at hand. Sleep was hard to come by, as every snapping twig or rustling leaf had us on edge, wondering if the beast was lurking just outside. About 10 days after my encounter, our closest neighbors, the Johnsons, were attacked. They were woken in the middle of the night by a commotion in their chicken coop. Mr. Johnson grabbed his gun and headed out to investigate. What happened next? I heard directly from Mrs. Johnson the following day, her eyes still wide with terror as she recounted it. Her husband had just stepped off the porch when an enormous hairy shape burst out of the shadows. It moved so fast he didn't even have time to raise his gun. The thing slammed into him, knocking him flat. As he struggled to get up, it effortlessly picked him up and threw him nearly 20 feet through the air. He crashed into the side of the barn and crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Mrs. Johnson screamed, and the beast turned towards the house. She said she'll never forget the sight of it in the moonlight. Close to 9 feet tall, massively muscled, covered in long, reddish-brown hair. The face was flat and ape-like, but with an expression of cunning intelligence that was terrifyingly human. It started to move towards her, but then stopped suddenly, head cocked as if listening to something. After a moment, it turned and loped off into the woods, clearing their 5-foot fence in a single bound. Mrs. Johnson ran to her husband, who thankfully was alive but badly injured with a broken arm and ribs. The next day, a group of men from neighboring farms got together to try to track the creature. I went along, equal parts terrified and determined to put an end to the beast that was terrorizing our community. We found its tracks easily enough. The 13-inch footprints were unmistakable. We followed the trail deep into the mountains, an area none of us had really explored before. The tracks seemed to go on forever, up steep ravines and across rushing streams. Whatever this thing was, it had incredible endurance. After several hours, we came to a hillside dotted with small caves. The tracks led right up to the largest opening. As we approached the cave entrance, an overwhelming musky odor hit us. It was like a cross between wet dog and rotting meat. Peering into the gloom, I could make out large bones scattered on the ground, deer and cattle mostly, but a few that looked disturbingly human. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the depths of the cave. We all froze. Then 2 glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, followed by the massive, hair-covered shape of the beast as it emerged into the light. Up close, it was even more terrifying than I remembered. It towered over us, muscles rippling beneath its shaggy coat. Those intelligent eyes swept over our group as its lips curled back in a snarl, revealing huge yellowed fangs. For a moment, nobody moved. Then somebody's nerve broke and a shot rang out. All hell broke loose. The beast roared in rage and charged. Men were scattering and firing wildly. I raised my own rifle, but my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't aim. The creature moved faster than seemed possible for its size. It swatted men aside like rag dolls, sending them flying with bone-crushing force. I saw it pick up old Mr. Davis and snap his spine like a twig before tossing him aside. In the chaos, I tripped and fell. I looked up to see the beast looming over me, raising a massive clawed hand to strike. In that moment, I was certain I was about to die. But then another shot rang out, and the creature jerked back, dark blood blossoming on its chest. It let out a roar of pain and rage before bounding away up the mountainside, disappearing into the forest with those incredible 15-foot leaps. Those of us who could still walk helped the injured back down the mountain. 5 men died that day, and several more were badly hurt. We never found the beast again, though for years afterward there were occasional sightings or livestock killings attributed to it. To this day, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those inhuman eyes still haunting my dreams. I don't know what that creature was, some kind of undiscovered ape, a Cherokee legend come to life, or something else entirely. But I know what I saw, and the terror of that summer will stay with me for the rest of my days. Story 14. I still can't believe what happened that day in Panama. It's been years, but the memory is seared into my mind like it was yesterday. I was part of a surveying team working on the new water system project in 1852. We'd been trekking through dense jungle for weeks, mapping out potential routes and water sources. It was grueling work. Hot, humid, and full of biting insects. But nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that fateful afternoon. We were following a small creek, hoping it would lead to a larger water source we could tap into. The jungle was thick on both sides, limiting visibility to just a few feet in any direction. I was at the front of our group, machete in hand, hacking away at vines and branches to clear a path. The constant drone of insects and bird calls filled the air. Suddenly, I froze. Through a gap in the foliage ahead, I caught a glimpse of movement by the creek. At first I thought it was just a large animal, maybe a tapir or jaguar. But as I peered closer, my blood ran cold. There, crouched by the water's edge, was what looked like a man, but unlike any man I'd ever seen before. He was completely naked, his body caked in mud and grime. Long, matted black hair hung down past his shoulders. His muscles were lean and sinewy, like those of a wild animal. But it was his eyes that struck me most. They were intensely alert and almost feral-looking as they darted around, taking in his surroundings. I held up my hand, signaling the others to stop and stay quiet. For a few moments we all just stared in stunned silence. None of us could quite believe what we were seeing. Was this some kind of native tribesman, a crazy hermit, or something else entirely? Cautiously, I took a step forward, trying to get a better look. A twig snapped under my boot, and the creature's head whipped around to face us. Those wild eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no trace of recognition or human understanding in that gaze, only raw animal instinct. "Hello?" I called out softly in Spanish, not wanting to startle him. "We mean you no harm." The creature cocked his head, looking confused. Clearly, he didn't understand. I tried again in English, but got the same blank response. Whatever this being was, he didn't seem to comprehend human speech. He remained frozen in place, muscles tensed, as if ready to bolt at any moment. Slowly, I took another step forward, holding my hands out in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "It's all right," I said soothingly, though I knew he couldn't understand the words. "We just want to help you." That was apparently the wrong move. In a flash, the creature leapt to his feet with surprising agility. Before any of us could react, he had bounded up the creek bank and disappeared into the thick jungle foliage. "Wait!" I called out, stumbling forward. But it was no use. By the time we reached the spot where he'd been, there was no trace left behind. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. We spent the next several hours combing the surrounding area, searching for any sign of the mysterious wild man. But the jungle quickly swallowed up any trail. As the sun began to set, we were forced to give up the search and make camp for the night. Around the campfire that evening, we debated what exactly we had seen. Some thought it must have been a member of some unknown indigenous tribe, living deep in the jungle away from civilization. Others suggested it could have been an escaped mental patient or criminal hiding out in the wilderness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd encountered something much stranger. The raw, animalistic nature of the creature, his complete lack of human mannerisms or understanding, it all pointed to something beyond normal human experience. Throughout the night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me bolt upright, half expecting to see those feral eyes staring at me from the darkness. Even in the safety of our camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As we packed up and continued our survey work the next morning, the atmosphere in our group had changed. Everyone was on edge, jumping at shadows and speaking in hushed tones. We all knew we had glimpsed something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our rational modern world. Over the following days and weeks, we continued to explore deeper into the jungle, but we never saw the wild man again. It was as if he had been swallowed up by the landscape itself, becoming one with the impenetrable green maze that surrounded us. Even after we completed our work and returned to civilization, I couldn't stop thinking about that encounter. I scoured historical records and anthropological reports, trying to find any mention of similar sightings. But there was nothing concrete, only vague legends and campfire tales told by indigenous tribes about mysterious forest spirits and wild people living in the deepest, darkest parts of the jungle. To this day, I'm not sure what to make of what we saw. Was it truly some kind of undiscovered hominid species, a feral human who had somehow survived alone in the wilderness, or something even stranger that defies classification? All I know is that it shook my understanding of the world to its core. It made me realize how little we truly know about the hidden corners of our planet, and what secrets might still be lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. Whenever I find myself in wild places now, I can't help but scan the tree line, half expecting to catch a glimpse of that shaggy figure. The memory of those intense, inhuman eyes still haunts my dreams, and I'm left with the unsettling certainty that there are things in this world that simply can't be explained by our current understanding of science and nature. I've never spoken publicly about what happened that day. Who would believe such an outlandish tale? But I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere out there, in the vastness of the Panamanian jungle, that creature is still out there, watching, waiting, a living reminder of how much we have yet to discover about our world and ourselves. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever truly understand what we encountered that day, or if perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved, hidden away in the wild places where few humans dare to tread. All I can say for certain is that my experience in Panama changed me forever. It opened my eyes to possibilities I never would have considered before, and it left me with a deep respect for the unknown wonders that still exist in this world, if only we have the courage to seek them out. Story 15. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been years now. I was out in the woods near Walder, Maine, cutting firewood like I did most days. It was a crisp fall morning in 1855, and the air had that sharp scent of decaying leaves. I'd been at it for a few hours, my axe rhythmically striking the logs, when I heard it, a high-pitched, inhuman shriek that made my blood run cold. At first I froze in place, my axe suspended mid-swing. The sound had come from deeper in the forest, beyond where I could see through the trees. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the occasional bird call or rustle of leaves. Then I heard it again, a piercing cry that sent shivers down my spine. It didn't sound like any animal I knew, and I've lived in these woods my whole life. Against my better judgment, I set down my axe and started moving toward the sound. Something compelled me to investigate, even as every instinct screamed at me to run the other way. I picked my way carefully through the underbrush, trying to stay quiet. The cries were getting louder, more frantic. As I pushed through a thick tangle of bushes, I suddenly found myself in a small clearing, and there, in the center, was something I'll never forget as long as I live. At first glance, it looked almost like a small child, no more than 18 inches tall. But as I looked closer, I realized this was no human child. Its body was covered in coarse black hair, like a bear's pelt. The face was flat and ape-like, with a protruding jaw and deep-set eyes that glinted with what looked unsettlingly like intelligence. Its arms were long and muscular, ending in hand-like appendages with sharp claws. As it saw me, it let out another of those blood-curdling shrieks and tried to scramble away on all fours. I don't know what came over me in that moment. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe some primal instinct to capture this impossible creature. Without thinking, I lunged forward and managed to grab it around its midsection. The thing went wild, thrashing and clawing at my arms. Its strength was incredible for its size. It felt like trying to hold onto a wildcat. I yelled out in pain as its claws raked across my forearm, drawing blood, but I didn't let go. Somehow, I managed to pin its arms to its sides and lift it off the ground. It continued to shriek and struggle as I stumbled back through the woods toward my homestead, my mind reeling at what I'd found. By the time I made it back to my cabin, my arms were covered in scratches and I was breathing hard from the exertion. The creature had quieted somewhat, though it still squirmed in my grip. I fumbled to open the door one-handed and practically fell inside. For a moment I just stood there in my cabin, holding this impossible being and wondering what in God's name I was supposed to do next. I couldn't just let it go. Who would believe me if I didn't have proof? But I couldn't keep holding it forever either. My eyes fell on an old chicken coop in the corner that I'd been meaning to repair. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do for now. I quickly cleared it out and reinforced the wire mesh sides. Then, as gently as I could, I placed the creature inside and latched the door. It immediately started shrieking again, rattling the coop so hard I was afraid it might break free. I backed away, my heart pounding. What had I done? What was this thing? As the reality of the situation sank in, I started to panic. I paced back and forth, running my hands through my hair. Should I tell someone? Would they even believe me? Or would they think I'd gone mad? I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with indecision. The creature's cries had quieted to a low, mournful whimper that was almost worse than the shrieks. It was curled up in the corner of the coop now, its large eyes fixed on me. Finally, I knew I had to tell someone. This was too big to keep to myself. I threw on my coat and ran to my nearest neighbor, old Tom Baker. I must have looked half crazed when I pounded on his door, babbling about finding a monster in the woods. To his credit, Tom didn't slam the door in my face. He listened patiently as I spilled out the whole story, then insisted on coming back to my cabin to see for himself. I led him inside, my hands shaking as I pointed to the coop. Tom's eyes went wide when he saw the creature. He stumbled backward, crossing himself and muttering a prayer under his breath. "Good Lord above," he whispered. "What is that thing?" I shook my head helplessly. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it." Tom turned to me, his face pale. "We need to tell others, the sheriff at least. Maybe someone will know what to do." I nodded, relieved to have someone else involved. Tom hurried off to fetch the sheriff, while I stayed to keep an eye on our strange captive. As I waited, I tried to get a better look at the creature. It seemed to have calmed somewhat, though it still eyed me warily. Up close, I could see even more unsettling details. Its feet were large and flat, almost human-like, but with opposable toes. Its ears were pointed and swiveled like a cat's, and its eyes. There was an uncanny intelligence there, a depth that made me shiver. It wasn't long before I heard the sound of approaching horses. Tom had returned with Sheriff Davis and a small crowd of curious townsfolk. Word had apparently spread fast. The next few hours were a blur. People crowded into my small cabin, jostling for a look at the creature. There were gasps of shock, cries of fear and amazement. Some insisted it must be some kind of monkey that had escaped from a traveling circus. Others muttered about demons and devils. Sheriff Davis tried to keep order, but it was clear he was as baffled as the rest of us. He sent a telegram to the state capital, hoping for guidance from officials there. In the meantime, he stationed a deputy at my cabin to keep watch. As night fell, most of the onlookers dispersed, though a few diehards camped outside, unwilling to miss any developments. I was exhausted, but too keyed up to sleep. I sat by the coop, watching the creature. It had retreated to the farthest corner, huddled in on itself. In the quiet of the night, I found myself talking to it softly. "What are you?" I murmured. "Where did you come from?" To my shock, the creature lifted its head and seemed to study me intently. For a moment I could have sworn I saw a flicker of understanding in its eyes. But then it turned away again, and I told myself I must have imagined it. The next few days were chaos. News of the capture spread like wildfire. Reporters from as far as Boston showed up, along with all manner of scientists and curiosity seekers. Everyone wanted to see the Walder wonder, as they'd taken to calling it. I was uncomfortable with all the attention, but I didn't know what else to do. The creature was clearly suffering in its cramped confinement, but no one seemed to know how to properly care for it. It refused most food we offered, only reluctantly drinking some water. As the days wore on, I found myself feeling increasingly guilty. Whatever this being was, it didn't deserve to be treated like this. But every time I considered releasing it, I imagined the ridicule and disbelief I'd face if I couldn't prove what I'd seen. On the 5th night after the capture, I was jolted awake by a commotion outside. I rushed out to find a group of men trying to break into my cabin. They were shouting about killing the devil's spawn and waving torches. In the chaos, I lost sight of the creature. By the time the sheriff arrived to disperse the mob, I realized with horror that the coop was empty. The wire mesh had been torn open, whether by the creature itself or one of the intruders, I couldn't tell. We searched the woods for days, but found no trace of the strange being. Some said good riddance, that it had been an abomination. Others were disappointed, feeling we'd lost a chance to study something truly extraordinary. As for me, I was left with more questions than answers. In the years since, I've often wondered about that creature. Was it some unknown species, a missing link between man and ape, or something else entirely beyond our understanding? I've never seen anything like it again, though sometimes on quiet nights I think I hear a distant, high-pitched cry echoing through the trees, and I wonder if, somewhere out there, that strange little being is still roaming the forests of Maine, a mystery that will never be solved. Story 16. I was just a young lad of 17 when it happened, back in the harsh winter of 1856. I'll never forget that day as long as I live. The memory of it still sends chills down my spine, even all these years later. It was early January, and Hornsville had been gripped by one of the coldest winters anyone could remember. The swamps and marshes surrounding our little town were frozen solid, creating an eerie landscape of ice and skeletal trees. Despite the brutal cold, a group of local men had organized an expedition to track down what they called a wild man that had been spotted lurking in the area. Being young and foolish, I begged my pa to let me join the hunting party. After much pleading, he reluctantly agreed, probably figuring it would toughen me up. How I wish now he had forbidden me from going. We set out at dawn, a group of about 10 men bundled up in our warmest furs and leathers. The bitter wind stung my face as we trudged through the snow-covered swampland. For hours we saw no sign of anything unusual, just endless white plains broken up by the dark silhouettes of barren trees. It was nearing midday when one of the men suddenly stopped and pointed. There, in the distance, was a large, dark figure moving swiftly across the ice. Even from afar, I could tell this was no ordinary man. It seemed to be at least 6 feet tall, maybe more, with a powerful build. But strangest of all was the way it moved, with an unnatural speed and agility across the treacherous terrain. "There it is, boys!" shouted old Mr. Hawkins, the leader of our group. "After it!" We gave chase as best we could, but the creature was so fast. It bounded across the ice with ease while we stumbled and slipped. As we got closer, I could make out more details that made my blood run cold. The thing was covered in thick, shaggy brown hair from head to toe. Not fur like an animal, but hair, as if a man had somehow grown a coat of it all over his body. For nearly an hour we pursued the wild man across the frozen swamp. My lungs burned from the exertion and the icy air. Just when it seemed we might be gaining on it, the creature suddenly changed direction and charged straight at us. It all happened so fast. The wild man barreled into our group like a battering ram, scattering men left and right. I was knocked to the ground, the wind driven from my body. As I struggled to my feet, I saw old Mr. Hawkins grappling with the beast. Even a big man like Hawkins looked small next to this thing. It stood at least 6'4", with bulging muscles visible even beneath the matted hair covering its body. With terrifying strength, the wild man lifted Hawkins clean off the ground and hurled him several yards across the ice. Hawkins hit hard and lay still. The rest of us were too stunned to react, as the creature then grabbed the reins of Hawkins' horse. In one fluid motion, it vaulted onto the animal's back and spurred it into a gallop. We watched helplessly as the wild man and stolen horse disappeared into the distance, heading towards the mountains to the north. It wasn't until they were out of sight that we snapped out of our daze and rushed to check on Hawkins. He was alive, thank God, but badly injured. His arm was broken, and he had a nasty gash on his head. We managed to get Hawkins back to town, where the doctor tended to him. But the wild man was long gone. In the days that followed, search parties combed the mountains, but found no trace. It was as if the creature had vanished into thin air. Folks in town had all sorts of theories about what we'd encountered. Some said it must have been a bear, despite none of us ever seeing a bear move like that or ride a horse. Others whispered about monsters and demons. A traveling preacher who came through claimed it was the spirit of a settler who'd gotten lost in the swamps years ago and gone feral. Me? I don't rightly know what to think, even now. What I saw that day defied explanation. It moved like a man, but no man I've ever known could run across ice like it was solid ground. And that hair, good Lord, that thick brown hair covering every inch of its body. The strength it displayed in tossing Hawkins like a rag doll still haunts my dreams. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, but then I remember the wild, feral eyes that locked onto mine for just a moment as it charged past. There was intelligence there, and something else I couldn't quite name. Rage, fear. Whatever it wasn't human. Not entirely. I've never spoken much about what happened that day. Folks tend to look at you funny when you start talking about wild men in the woods. But I know what I saw. That thing was real as you or me. And sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howls outside my window, I lie awake wondering, is it still out there, roaming the wilderness, hiding from civilization? And if it is, what would happen if it ever decided to come back? I don't go into the swamps anymore if I can help it. I've had my fill of adventure for one lifetime. But I'll never forget that day in January of 1856, when 10 of us went hunting for a wild man and found something beyond our worst nightmares. It may have been over 50 years ago now, but the memory is as fresh as if it happened yesterday. Some things you just can't shake, no matter how hard you try. Story 17. It was late autumn, and I was on a routine hunting and trapping expedition in the foothills of Mount St. Helens. I'd been out there dozens of times before, knew the terrain like the back of my hand. But this trip was different. There was an eerie stillness in the forest that put me on edge from the start. I'd set up camp near a small stream, planning to spend a few days checking my trap lines and hunting for elk. That first night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I set out at first light to check my traps. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels, just a heavy, oppressive silence. As I made my way along the stream, I started noticing odd things. Branches snapped off trees at heights no normal animal could reach. Strange, massive footprints in the mud that made my stomach clench with fear. I tried to convince myself it was just a large bear, but the prints were all wrong. Too big, too humanoid. My hands shook as I reset my traps, constantly glancing over my shoulder. That's when I heard it. a low, guttural vocalization that echoed through the trees. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, but not quite human either. The sound chilled me to my core. I grabbed my rifle and started making my way back to camp as quickly and quietly as I could. That's when I saw it. Through a gap in the trees, about 50 yards away, stood the most terrifying creature I've ever laid eyes on. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't just some animal. It stood upright, on 2 legs, its arms hanging at its sides. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Then the thing tilted its head and made a series of low, rumbling noises. It took me a second to realize what was happening. It was trying to communicate. Those weren't random animal sounds. They had structure, intention behind them. That's when true panic set in. This wasn't just some undiscovered species of ape or bear. This was something intelligent, something that shouldn't exist. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush in blind terror. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, branches snapping as the creature gave chase. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs were on fire, my legs trembling with exhaustion, but fear kept me going, pushing me beyond my limits. Eventually, I reached a steep ravine and half climbed, half tumbled down the slope. I wedged myself into a crevice between some boulders, trying to muffle my ragged breathing. For what felt like hours, I huddled there in the growing darkness. I could hear movement in the forest above, heavy footsteps, low vocalizations. Sometimes it sounded like one creature, sometimes like several. They were searching for me, calling to each other in that bizarre, almost language. As night fell, the sounds gradually faded, but I was too terrified to move. I spent that whole night crammed in that tiny space, shivering with cold and fear. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of panic through me. I was convinced that at any moment, a massive, fur-covered hand would reach into my hiding spot and drag me out. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously emerged from my hiding place. The forest was quiet again, but not the peaceful quiet of a normal morning. It was that same eerie stillness from the day before, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I gathered what little courage I had left and began making my way back to my camp. I half expected to find my tent torn to shreds, my supplies scattered, but everything was exactly as I'd left it. If it weren't for the mud caked on my clothes and the scratches covering my arms and face, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. I didn't waste any time. I quickly packed up my gear, leaving most of my traps behind. I couldn't get out of those woods fast enough. As I hiked back towards civilization, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see those creatures watching me from the trees. It took me 2 days of hard travel to reach Fort Vancouver. I must have looked half mad when I stumbled in, wild-eyed and babbling about giant talking beasts in the forest. Most folks dismissed my story as the ravings of a man gone mad from too much time alone in the wilderness. A few of the native traders gave me knowing looks, but they wouldn't say much when I pressed them for information. I never went back to that part of the territory again. In fact, I quit my job with the Hudson's Bay Company not long after and moved east. I couldn't bear the thought of being anywhere near those mountains, those forests, where impossible things lurked in the shadows. For years, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by fear and isolation. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Those creatures are out there, hidden away in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. Sometimes on quiet nights, I still hear those low, rumbling vocalizations in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat. I'm an old man now, and I've carried this secret for far too long. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I needed to tell my story. Those creatures, whatever they are intelligent. They can communicate, and they're out there watching, waiting. I just hope that by sharing my experience, I might warn others who venture into those remote forests. Be careful out there, and if you hear something calling to you from the trees, run, and don't look back. Story 18. I was just a young trapper, barely 20 years old, when I joined Inspector Anderson's expedition along the Fraser River in 1864. It was my first big job with the Hudson's Bay Company, and I was eager to prove myself. Little did I know the terrifying encounter that awaited us in those remote mountains. We'd been traveling for weeks, making our way through the rugged terrain of British Columbia. The landscape was breathtaking, towering evergreens, jagged peaks, and the rushing waters of the Fraser. But there was also an eerie stillness at times, a sense that we were being watched from the shadows. One evening, as we made camp along the riverbank, I noticed Inspector Anderson seemed on edge. He kept glancing warily at the dense forest and craggy cliffs looming above us. When I asked if everything was all right, he just grunted and told me to stay alert. As night fell, an unsettling quiet descended. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just the gentle gurgle of the river and the crackling of our campfire. I tried to shake off my growing unease, telling myself it was just nerves. But then I heard it, a deep, guttural sound echoing from the cliffs. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, halfway between a roar and a howl. My blood ran cold. The other men were on their feet in an instant, rifles at the ready. Inspector Anderson barked orders for us to douse the fire and take cover. As darkness engulfed us, more of those bone-chilling howls filled the air. They seemed to be coming from all around us. Suddenly, a massive boulder came hurtling down from the cliffs, narrowly missing our camp. Then another crashed into the river, sending up a huge splash. Panic set in as we realized we were under attack. But from what? In the dim moonlight, I caught glimpses of enormous, shadowy figures moving along the ridgeline. They were hurling rocks and tree limbs down at us with incredible force. One of the men cried out as a stone struck his shoulder. We returned fire, our rifle shots echoing through the canyon, but it seemed to only enrage our attackers further. The barrage intensified. Boulders rained down, smashing our supplies and nearly crushing us. We had no choice but to abandon camp and flee along the riverbank. As we ran, I dared to look back. What I saw chilled me to my core. Illuminated by the moonlight on the cliffs above were several massive ape-like creatures. They must have been 8 or 9 feet tall, with matted hair covering their bodies. Their faces were a terrifying blend of human and animal features. As one of them let out another haunting howl, I saw gleaming fangs in its gaping maw. I'd heard whispered stories of the wild men of the mountains from native guides, but had dismissed them as mere legends. Now I was faced with the horrifying reality that such creatures actually existed. We sprinted through the darkness, slipping on wet rocks and crashing through underbrush. The monstrous howls pursued us, along with the thunderous impacts of hurled boulders. One of the men stumbled and fell. I grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet, urging him onward. It felt like we ran for hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes or so. Finally, we reached a narrow gorge and took shelter in a small cave. We huddled there, gasping for breath, straining our ears for any sign of pursuit. Gradually the night grew quiet again, but none of us dared to move or speak. We remained in that cave until dawn broke, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. As sunlight finally bathed the canyon, Inspector Anderson cautiously ventured out to survey the area. The forest looked peaceful in the morning light, with no sign of the terrors we'd faced. But the haunted look in Anderson's eyes told me he'd seen the same horrifying creatures I had. When we finally mustered the courage to return to our camp, we found it utterly destroyed. Supplies were smashed, tents were shredded, and massive boulders littered the area. After salvaging what we could, we hastily departed that cursed stretch of river. The rest of our expedition was uneventful, but I never stopped looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those monstrous forms emerge from the trees. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that night. The bone-chilling howls, the inhuman strength as they hurled boulders like pebbles, those terrifying shadowy forms. I've never returned to that part of British Columbia. Some places are best left alone, their secrets untouched. I know most people would think I'm crazy if I shared this story. They'd say it was just bears or maybe some kind of mass hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But I know what I saw. Those weren't any normal animals. They were something ancient and primal, something that defies scientific explanation. Inspector Anderson only mentioned the incident briefly in his official report, referring to an attack by hostile natives. I suspect he feared being labeled a madman if he told the full truth. But in private conversations years later, I could see in his eyes that he was haunted by the same memories that tormented me. Sometimes I wonder if those creatures are still out there, hidden away in the vastness of the Canadian wilderness. Do they watch silently as hikers and campers unknowingly pass through their territory, or have they retreated deeper into the mountains, trying to avoid the encroachment of civilization? Part of me hopes they no longer exist, that what we encountered was the last of a dying breed. But another part of me feels a strange sense of awe at the idea that such mysterious beings could remain undiscovered in our modern world. It's a reminder that nature still holds many secrets, some of which may be better left uncovered. I've never told this story publicly before. Even now my hands shake as I type these words. But as I've gotten older, I've felt a growing need to share my experience. Maybe it will serve as a warning to others who venture into those remote wilds. Or maybe it will simply stand as a testament to the inexplicable wonders and terrors that still exist in this world. All I know is that my encounter on the Fraser River changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows of mountains and forests, defying our attempts to categorize and explain them. So if you ever find yourself in the wilds of British Columbia and you hear an otherworldly howl echoing in the night, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Just know that you may be in the presence of something ancient and powerful, something that was here long before us and may remain long after we're gone. And whatever you do, don't let it catch you alone in the dark. Story 19. I was just a young boy when it happened, barely 10 years old. My family had moved to Manitu Island in Lake Michigan earlier that year, in 1868. Pa said there were good trapping and fishing opportunities, and Ma was excited about starting a new life away from the crowded cities. I was mostly just scared. The island seemed so wild and remote compared to our old home. That summer started out normal enough. Pa would go out hunting and trapping most days, while Ma tended to our little cabin and garden. My older sister Jane and I helped out where we could, but we also had plenty of time to explore the forests and beaches. It was on one of those exploring days in late August that everything changed. Jane and I had wandered further than usual, following a small stream deep into the heart of the island. The trees grew thick there, blocking out most of the sunlight. I remember feeling a chill, even though it was a warm day. We were just about to turn back when we heard it. A strange, guttural sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was almost like a mix between a bear's growl and a man's shout. Jane grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" I whispered. She shook her head, clearly as confused as I was. We stood frozen for a moment, straining our ears. Then we heard it again, closer this time. There was a crashing sound in the underbrush, like something large moving through the forest. That's when we saw it. Through a gap in the trees, about 50 yards away, stood the most terrifying creature I've ever laid eyes on. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in thick, matted hair from head to toe. But it wasn't a bear or any other animal I knew. It stood upright on 2 legs like a man. Its face is what haunts me to this day. It had a high forehead and intelligent, almost human-like eyes. A long beard hung from its chin, but there was something wild and feral in its expression that chilled me to the bone. For a moment, we all just stared at each other, Jane and I frozen in terror, the creature seemingly as surprised to see us as we were to see it. Then it let out an ear-splitting roar that shook the trees around us. Jane screamed, and we both turned and ran as fast as we could. I could hear the creature crashing through the forest behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We ran until our lungs burned, stumbling over roots and branches in our panic. Finally, we burst out of the tree line near our cabin. Pa was outside chopping wood and looked up in shock as we came tearing across the clearing. "What in tarnation?" he exclaimed as we collapsed at his feet, gasping for air. Between sobs, we managed to tell him what we'd seen. His face grew grave as he listened. Without a word, he went inside and came back out with his rifle. "You two stay here with your ma," he said firmly. "I'm going to gather some of the other men, and we're going to check this out." I clung to Ma as we watched Pa disappear into the forest with several other island men. They were gone for hours. When they finally returned as night was falling, they looked shaken. "We found tracks," Pa told us quietly. "Big ones, like nothing I've ever seen. And we heard noises, but we couldn't find the creature itself." That night, none of us slept. We huddled together in the cabin, jumping at every little sound from the forest. Pa sat by the window with his rifle across his lap, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The next few days were a blur of fear and confusion. More search parties were organized, but they found no further sign of the creature. Some of the island families, including ours, moved into the small town for safety. There was talk of abandoning the island altogether. As the days turned to weeks with no more sightings, life slowly began to return to normal. But things were never quite the same after that. There was always a tension, a wariness when venturing into the forest. It wasn't until years later that I learned about the missing child from decades before. Apparently, a 5-year-old boy had vanished without a trace while playing near the forest edge. Some of the old-timers began to wonder if there was a connection. To this day, I don't know what Jane and I saw in those woods. Was it some kind of undiscovered animal, a feral human who'd somehow survived alone on the island for years, or something else entirely? All I know is that the memory of those intelligent eyes staring at me from that hairy, primitive face still gives me nightmares. Sometimes when the wind howls through the trees at night, I could swear I hear that bone-chilling roar echoing in the distance. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family before. Most people would think I was crazy or making it up, but I know what I saw that day, and I know that somewhere out there, in the deepest parts of Manitu Island, something is still lurking in the shadows. The incident changed me profoundly. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep without a light on. Every creak of the cabin at night made me jump. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, always scanning the tree line when outside. The carefree days of exploring the island were over. Pa tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just a bear we'd seen, but I could tell by the worry in his eyes that he didn't really believe that. He started carrying his rifle everywhere, even just to check the traps near the cabin. Ma wouldn't let us go anywhere alone anymore. The other island families were spooked too. There were hushed conversations among the adults, worried glances cast towards the forest. Some families left the island entirely, unwilling to live with the constant fear of what might be out there. As autumn approached, a chill settled over the island. and not just from the cooling weather. There was a sense of unease that never quite went away. The forest that had once seemed welcoming now felt oppressive and dangerous. I remember one night in particular, about a month after the sighting. A storm was raging outside, rain lashing against the cabin windows, and wind howling through the trees. We were all huddled around the fireplace when suddenly there was a loud crack from outside, like a tree branch snapping. Pa grabbed his rifle and peered out the window, but it was pitch black beyond the faint glow of our lantern. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw two glowing eyes reflecting the light, watching us from the edge of the forest. But when I blinked, they were gone. We all slept in the main room that night, too scared to be alone in our beds. I lay awake for hours, straining my ears for any sound above the storm. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the cabin made my heart race. As the weeks passed and winter set in, the fear began to fade somewhat. There were no more sightings or strange occurrences. But the island had changed. The carefree innocence of that summer was gone, replaced by a wariness that never quite left us. Years later, when I was a young man, I tried to research what we might have seen that day. I read about Native American legends of wild men in the forests, about creatures like Bigfoot. But nothing quite matched what Jane and I had encountered. The mystery gnawed at me. I would find myself staring out at the forest, wondering if it was still out there somewhere. Had it been some kind of isolated incident? Or was there a whole population of these creatures living in the remote parts of the island? I never saw the creature again, but its impact on my life was permanent. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. It taught me that the wilderness, for all its beauty, can hold dangers we can't even imagine. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd encountered it closer up, or if it had chased us all the way back to the cabin. The thought still makes my blood run cold. But mostly, I'm left with an overwhelming sense of awe and mystery. There's so much we don't know about the world around us, so many unexplored places, undiscovered creatures. That day on Manitu Island showed me that the line between the known and unknown is thinner than we think. And sometimes, just sometimes, that line can be crossed in the most terrifying and extraordinary ways. I'm an old man now, and Manitu Island has changed a lot since those days. But every time I visit, I can't help but glance towards those deep forests. And I wonder, is it still out there, watching and waiting? Will anyone else ever see what Jane and I saw that summer day so long ago? I may never know the answers, but the memory of those intelligent eyes, that towering hairy figure, and that bone-chilling roar will stay with me until the day I die. It was the day I learned that the world is a far stranger and more mysterious place than we can ever truly comprehend. Story 20. I was just a young lad back in 1840, working as a farmhand on the outskirts of a small settlement in the Australian bush. Life was simple then, tending to the livestock, mending fences and helping with the crops. But nothing could have prepared me for what I witnessed that fateful day. It was a scorching hot afternoon in late summer. The sun beat down mercilessly as I made my way along the edge of the property, checking for any breaks in the fencing where wild dogs might get through. As I neared the base of a steep, rocky hillside, I heard a commotion up ahead, shouts and cries that didn't sound like any language I recognized. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept forward cautiously, using the sparse scrub as cover. As I peered around a large boulder, my blood ran cold at the scene before me. A group of Aboriginal warriors, maybe 6 or 7 of them, had surrounded some kind of creature. At first glance, it looked almost human in shape and size, but as I looked closer, I realized with mounting horror that its entire body was covered in thick, coarse grey hair. The thing let out an inhuman shriek that made my skin crawl. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. The warriors were shouting and jabbing at it with their spears, herding it up against the rocky hillside. Despite its obvious strength and ferocity, the creature seemed terrified, lashing out wildly as it tried to escape. I wanted to run, to get as far away from there as possible, but I found myself paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrifying spectacle. One of the warriors managed to get in close, driving his spear deep into the creature's side. It let out an agonized howl that echoed off the hillside. Dark blood matted its grey fur as it stumbled and fell to its knees. The warriors closed in for the kill, their spears flashing in the sunlight. I squeezed my eyes shut, unable to watch the gruesome end. When I opened them again, the creature lay motionless on the ground, its lifeblood seeping into the parched earth. To my shock, the warriors then grabbed the creature's lifeless body and began dragging it up the hillside. I could hear them grunting with exertion as they hauled the heavy corpse over the rocky terrain. Where were they taking it? And why? I was burning with questions, but far too terrified to reveal myself or follow them. As the sounds of the warriors faded into the distance, I finally regained control of my trembling limbs. I turned and ran as fast as I could back towards the farmhouse, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, much to the alarm of the farmer's wife. "Harry, what on earth is the matter with you, boy?" she exclaimed. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to tell her what I'd witnessed, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? Who would believe such an outlandish tale? In the end, I simply shook my head and mumbled something about getting spooked by a snake. That night, I tossed and turned in my bunk, unable to banish the horrifying images from my mind. What was that creature? The natives had seemed to know exactly what it was, calling it something that sounded like yowie as they attacked it. But in all my years in the bush, I'd never seen nor heard of anything like it. The next morning, I rose early and snuck out to the hillside before my chores. Part of me hoped to find some evidence of what had transpired, bloodstains on the rocks maybe, or tracks in the dirt. But there was nothing. No sign at all of the violence I'd witnessed. If it weren't for the vivid memories seared into my brain, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. As the days passed, I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at every little sound or movement in the bush. I kept expecting to see another of those creatures lurking in the shadows. But life on the farm went on as normal, and gradually the intensity of the memory began to fade. I never told anyone what I saw that day. Who would have believed me? A creature that looked like a man, but was covered in grey fur. Warriors dragging its body up a hillside to who knows where. It sounded like the fevered imaginings of a madman. So I kept it to myself, tried my best to forget about it and move on with my life. But even now, all these years later, I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, that inhuman shriek echoing in my ears. I still find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a pair of dark eyes staring back at me from a fur-covered face. The encounter may have been brief, but it left an indelible mark on my psyche. I've heard whispers over the years of similar creatures spotted in remote areas. Stories told in hushed tones around campfires of hairy man-beasts lurking in the wilderness. Most dismiss them as tall tales or drunken hallucinations, but I know better. I've seen with my own eyes that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Sometimes I wonder what became of that creature's body. Did the warriors have some sacred ritual for disposing of such beings? Or did they study it, trying to unlock its secrets? I'll likely never know. But I often find myself staring up at that hillside, wondering what other mysteries might be hidden in the wild places of this land. I'm an old man now, and my adventuring days are long behind me. But I still feel a chill run down my spine whenever I hear strange noises in the night. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I could swear I hear that bone-chilling shriek echoing across the years. A reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, lurking just out of sight in the shadows. Story 21. As we trekked deeper into the wilderness, an eerie silence fell over the forest. The usual sounds of birds and small animals were absent, as if everything was holding its breath. A sense of unease crept over me, but I tried to shake it off. We had been walking for hours, when Fallerly suddenly held up his hand, signaling us to stop. He pointed to some strange tracks in the snow. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The prints were huge, easily twice the size of a man's foot, but they had no toes, and strangest of all, the heel marks were sharp and pointed. We followed the tracks cautiously, our rifles at the ready. As we rounded a bend between some thick pine trees, that's when we saw it. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with thick dark fur covering its body. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. It had one eye in the center of its forehead and another on its cheek. The mouth was lipless, revealing sharp yellowed teeth. For a moment, we all stood frozen in shock. Then the beast let out a bone-chilling roar and charged straight at us. Panic and adrenaline surged through me as we raised our rifles and fired. The gunshots echoed through the forest as we emptied our weapons into the creature. It stumbled and fell, but kept trying to get up, thrashing violently. Fallerly reloaded quickly and put 2 more shots into its head before it finally went still. My hands were shaking as we cautiously approached the fallen monster. Up close, its bizarre features were even more apparent. The fur wasn't like any animal I'd seen. It had an oily sheen to it, almost like sable. And those eyes. Even in death, they seemed to stare right through me. Its feet had no toes, just stumps, and the heels tapered to sharp points. Fallerly decided we needed to examine the creature further. Using his hunting knife, he cut open the abdomen. Dark, almost black blood oozed out. The internal organs were arranged in ways that made no sense. It was clear this was no ordinary animal. It was something unnatural, something that shouldn't exist. We debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to leave it there and pretend we'd never seen it. But Fallerly insisted we needed to alert the authorities. We fashioned a crude sled from tree branches to drag the carcass back to the village. It was brutally difficult work, hauling that massive body through the snow. By the time we reached Tabalch, night had fallen. The reaction in the village was one of horror and disbelief. People gathered to gawk at the monstrous corpse, crossing themselves and muttering prayers. The local priest was summoned, along with what passed for government officials in our remote area. They questioned us at length about where exactly we had encountered the creature. But something strange happened then. As we prepared to lead a larger group back to the site, the villagers who had been so eager to see the body suddenly became evasive. No one would agree to guide the officials to the location. Even Fallerly, who knew the forest better than anyone, claimed he couldn't remember the exact spot. It was as if a veil had been drawn over everyone's memories. I found myself unable to pinpoint where we'd been as well, though just hours earlier I could have sworn I'd remember the route. The harder I tried to recall, the more the details slipped away like wisps of smoke. Had the creature done something to our minds? Or was this some kind of collective delusion taking hold? The carcass itself began to decompose at an alarming rate. Within days, it had rotted down to bones and scraps of fur. The officials took what remained for further study, but I never heard anything more about it. It was as if the whole village had entered into an unspoken pact to forget what had happened. But I can't forget. The image of that thing is seared into my mind. Those misplaced eyes, the pointed heels, the oily fur. Sometimes I wake in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear its roar echoing in the distance. I've never gone hunting in those woods again. Whatever is out there, it's best left alone. To this day, I struggle to make sense of what we encountered. Was it some unknown species, a demon, a creature from another world? I don't have answers, only questions that haunt me. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows of what we think we know. And sometimes those things find us. Story 22. I still can't recall that day without feeling a chill run down my spine. It was late October 1849, and I had just moved to Eagle, Oklahoma with my wife to start a new life. We'd heard tales of opportunity out west, of land and resources waiting to be claimed, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in those God-forsaken swamps. I remember waking up before dawn that morning, restless from another night of fitful sleep. The air was damp and heavy as I made my way out to the porch, watching the mist roll in off the wetlands to the southwest. Something about those swamps always set me on edge. The way the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, the eerie silence broken only by unseen creatures slithering through murky waters. As the weak autumn sun began to rise, I decided to do a bit of exploring. We'd only been in Eagle a few weeks, and I was eager to survey more of the surrounding land, perhaps find a good spot for hunting or trapping. I grabbed my old rifle, more for comfort than protection, and set off towards the swamps, following a faint trail that meandered between gnarled cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The further I went, the thicker the fog became. Soon, I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The damp air clung to my skin and clothes, and an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Still, my pride and curiosity drove me onward. I'd come this far. Might as well press on a bit further before turning back. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. It was almost like a groan, but deeper, more primal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I peered into the mist, straining my eyes for any sign of movement. For several long moments, all was still. Then suddenly, through a break in the fog, I saw it. About 50 yards away, half hidden behind a massive tree trunk, was a creature. That's the only word I can use to describe it, though it fails to capture the true horror of what I witnessed. It stood maybe 7 feet tall, with a hunched, loping posture that made it seem almost ape-like. But this was no gorilla or any other animal I'd ever seen or read about. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging well past its knees. The thing was covered in coarse, dark grey fur that seemed matted and tangled, but it was the face that truly haunts me to this day. God help me, it was almost human, but twisted, feral. The eyes were sunken and glassy, set deep in a sloping brow. The nose was flat and wide, and the mouth— Lord, that mouth was filled with yellowed fangs that looked sharp enough to tear a man apart. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature hadn't seen me yet. It seemed to be sniffing the air, its massive head swiveling slowly from side to side. I knew I should run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if I'd been rooted to the spot by some unseen force. Then those terrible eyes locked onto mine, and time seemed to stand still. In that moment, I saw something in its gaze, not just animal hunger or predatory instinct, but a flicker of intelligence, awareness. Whatever it was, it chilled me to my very soul. The spell was broken when the thing let out a bone-chilling howl. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, part roar, part scream, utterly inhuman. That sound will haunt my nightmares for the rest of my days. Finally, my survival instinct kicked in. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. Branches whipped at my face and thorns tore at my clothes, but I barely felt them. All I knew was that I had to get away from that abomination. I could hear it pursuing me, its heavy footfalls and ragged breathing growing closer with each passing second. The way it moved was bizarre, a kind of loping, uneven gait that seemed impossibly fast for its awkward posture. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I broke free of the swamp and found myself on the outskirts of town. I didn't stop running until I reached my house, slamming the door behind me and collapsing to the floor in exhaustion and terror. My wife found me there, babbling incoherently about monsters in the swamp. She thought I'd gone mad from heat stroke or poisonous swamp gases. Part of me wished that were true, that it had all been some fevered hallucination. But I knew in my bones that what I'd seen was real. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, those terrible fangs. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear that unearthly howl echoing in the distance. I tried telling a few trusted friends about what I'd seen, but they just laughed it off as tall tales or the product of too much whiskey. The local authorities weren't interested either. They had real crimes to worry about, not chasing imaginary monsters through the swamp. As time passed, I began to doubt myself. Maybe it had been some kind of bear, deformed by disease or injury. Or perhaps my mind had played tricks on me, exaggerating a fleeting glimpse of some ordinary animal into something fantastical and terrifying. But deep down, I know the truth. What I saw that day was no mere animal. It was something in between. Not quite human, but not entirely beast either. A creature that shouldn't exist in this world, yet somehow does. I've never ventured back into those swamps, and I likely never will. The memory of that day is seared into my mind, a constant reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is right, I swear I can still hear that howl drifting in from the southwest, and I lie awake, wondering if that thing is still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next encounter with the world of men. I don't know if anyone will believe this account. Most days, I can barely believe it myself. But I swear on all that's holy, every word I've written here is the truth as I experienced it. I only hope that by sharing my story, I might warn others to be cautious. There are dark and terrible things hiding in the wild places of this world, things that should remain hidden. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or why it happened. Was it some unknown species, an evolutionary offshoot that science has yet to discover? Or something more sinister, a creature not of this earth? I'll likely never know the answer. But the experience has changed me forever. I no longer see the world as I once did. Now I know that behind the veil of what we consider normal, there lurk horrors beyond imagining. I've thought about leaving Eagle, about packing up and moving somewhere far from these accursed swamps. But something keeps me here, a morbid fascination perhaps, or a sense of unfinished business. Part of me wants to understand, to solve the mystery of what I encountered that day, but a larger part simply wants to forget, to bury the memory deep and never speak of it again. For now, I remain in Eagle, living my life as best I can with the weight of this secret. I keep a watchful eye on the swamps, especially at night, and I pray that whatever is out there stays there, hidden in the mists and shadows where it belongs, because if it ever decides to venture into the world of men again, God help us all. Story 23. By midday the sun was blazing overhead, and I retreated inside to escape the worst of it. I was sitting at my small wooden table, eating a simple lunch of rice and lentils, when I heard an odd noise coming from the front porch. At first I thought it might be one of the local monkeys that sometimes hang around looking for scraps. They can be pesky, but they're generally harmless, so I wasn't too concerned. But as I listened more closely, the sounds didn't seem quite right for a monkey. There was a rhythmic rustling, almost like pages turning, interspersed with low grunts. Curious, I got up and quietly made my way to the front door. I eased it open just a crack to peek out, not wanting to startle whatever creature was out there. What I saw made me freeze in shock, my hand still gripping the doorknob. Sitting on my porch, as casually as you please, was an enormous orangutan. And when I say enormous, I mean truly massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall if it had been standing upright. Its reddish-brown fur was shaggy and unkempt, with streaks of grey showing its age. But the size wasn't even the most astonishing thing. This creature was sitting in my rocking chair, calmly flipping through one of my books that I must have left outside. Its face was dark and wrinkled, framed by a wild tangle of white whiskers that gave it an almost grandfatherly appearance. The incongruity of this huge, primitive-looking beast engaging in such a human activity was utterly surreal. For several long moments, I simply stood there gaping, unable to fully process what I was seeing. The orangutan seemed completely absorbed in the book, its eyes intently scanning the pages. Every so often it would reach up with one massive hand to delicately turn to the next page. I found myself mesmerized by the dexterity and care with which it handled the fragile paper. As I watched, transfixed, the orangutan suddenly paused in its reading. It cocked its head slightly as if listening. Then, with shocking speed for such a large creature, its head whipped around and its eyes locked directly onto mine through the crack in the door. In that moment, looking into those deep brown eyes, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of intelligence and awareness. This was no mere animal. There was a spark of something almost human in that gaze. For a split second, we simply stared at each other, both seemingly equally surprised by the encounter. Then the moment shattered as the orangutan's lips peeled back in a snarl, exposing yellowed teeth the size of my thumbs. A guttural growl rumbled from its chest as it suddenly launched itself from the chair, the book tumbling forgotten to the porch. I stumbled backwards in alarm, my heart pounding. But instead of attacking, the creature made a beeline for the edge of the porch. With shocking agility, it leapt onto the railing and then hurled itself at a nearby tree. Its long arms easily caught a branch, and it swung itself up into the foliage with practiced ease. Within seconds, it had vanished into the thick jungle that surrounds my small homestead, leaving only swaying branches in its wake. The whole encounter probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt like time had stretched and distorted. I stood there for several long moments, struggling to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Part of me wondered if I'd dozed off and dreamed the whole thing. But when I finally gathered the courage to step out onto the porch, the evidence was undeniable. My rocking chair was askew, deep claw marks gouged into the wooden armrests. And there on the floor lay my battered copy of Robinson Crusoe, several pages crumpled from its rough handling. As my racing pulse began to slow, I found myself filled with a mixture of awe and unease. The sheer size and strength of the creature was terrifying to contemplate. If it had wanted to harm me, I would have been completely at its mercy, and yet it had fled rather than attack when discovered. But it was the clear signs of intelligence that truly shook me to my core. The careful way it had handled the book, the spark of awareness in its eyes, these spoke of a level of cognition I'd never imagined possible in a wild animal. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the nature of consciousness and the line between humans and other creatures. For the rest of the day, I found myself jumping at every little sound from the jungle, half expecting to see that massive form emerge from the undergrowth. I brought all my belongings inside and double-checked the locks on my doors and windows before going to bed that night. Sleep was elusive, my mind racing with questions and theories about what I'd seen. In the days since, I've scoured my small library for any information about orangutans or other great apes, but nothing I've found comes close to describing a creature of that size or apparent intelligence. I've debated whether to report the encounter to the local authorities, but I'm not sure they'd believe me. And part of me is reluctant to potentially put the creature in danger if it truly is some undiscovered species. So for now, I find myself in a strange limbo, hyper-aware of my surroundings, jumping at shadows, and constantly questioning my own perceptions. Was it really as large as I remember? Did I imagine that spark of self-awareness in its eyes? The rational part of my mind wants to dismiss the whole thing as some sort of hallucination or waking dream. But every time I see those claw marks on my rocking chair, I'm forced to confront the reality of what happened. I've taken to spending more time on my porch, ostensibly reading but really keeping a watchful eye on the jungle's edge. Part of me hopes to catch another glimpse of the creature, to prove to myself that I'm not going mad. But another part dreads the thought of coming face to face with it again. The memory of those enormous teeth and that bone-chilling growl still makes me shudder. In quieter moments, I find my thoughts drifting to more philosophical questions. If such a creature exists, what does it mean for our understanding of evolution and consciousness? Are there other undiscovered species out there with similar capabilities? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if this being is as intelligent as it seemed, what must it think of us humans encroaching on its territory? I know I'll likely never get answers to these questions. The vastness of the jungle and the creature's obvious ability to avoid detection make it unlikely I'll ever see it again. But I can't shake the feeling that my world has been irrevocably changed by those few moments on my porch. The comfortable certainties I once held about the natural world have been shaken to their core. As I write this, the sun is setting, and the jungle is coming alive with its nightly chorus of insects and birds. I find myself straining to hear any sound that might be out of place, a heavy footfall, the creak of a branch under significant weight. Every shadow seems to hold the potential for another encounter. I'm not sure what the future holds, or if I'll ever fully come to terms with what I saw that day. But I know that I'll never look at the jungle, or indeed the whole natural world, quite the same way again. There are wonders and mysteries out there beyond our current understanding, and sometimes they show up right on your front porch when you least expect it. Story 24. Back in 1847, I was a young trapper named Jack working in the Pacific Northwest. I had heard rumors about Mount St. Helens being forbidden territory for the local tribes, but I didn't pay much attention to that kind of talk. That is, until I met Paul Kane. Kane was an experienced explorer who had been investigating the legends surrounding the mountain. He told me about creatures the natives called skookums, cannibalistic beasts that supposedly inhabited the slopes of St. Helens. At first I laughed it off, but the look in Kane's eyes made me uneasy. He seemed genuinely disturbed by what he had learned. According to Kane, one of the tribal elders had shared a horrifying story with him. Years ago, 2 hunters from their tribe had ventured onto the mountain, ignoring the warnings. Only one returned alive, babbling in terror about watching his companion be torn apart and devoured by monstrous creatures. The survivor was never the same after that. I'll admit, hearing that tale sent a chill down my spine. But Kane was determined to investigate further. He even offered a substantial reward to any native who would guide him into the forbidden area. Not a single one would take him up on it, no matter how much money he offered. That's when I started to realize how serious this was. Against my better judgment, I agreed to accompany Kane on an expedition up the mountain. The pay was good, and part of me was curious to see if there was any truth to the legends. We set out early one crisp autumn morning, our packs loaded with supplies for a week-long trek. The first couple days were uneventful as we made our way up the lower slopes. But as we climbed higher, an oppressive silence fell over the forest. There were no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if all wildlife had abandoned this place. On the third night, we made camp in a small clearing. As darkness fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept seeing shadows moving just beyond the firelight, but when I looked directly at them, there was nothing there. Kane noticed my unease and admitted he felt it too. Neither of us slept much that night. The next morning, we pressed on toward the summit. The trees began to thin out, replaced by craggy rock formations. That's when we found the first clear sign that we weren't alone. Partially hidden behind a boulder was a crude shelter made of branches and animal hides. Scattered around it were gnawed bones, some animal, but others disturbingly human-like. My blood ran cold as I realized the legends might be true after all. Kane was fascinated, examining everything closely and taking notes. I wanted nothing more than to turn back, but he insisted on continuing. As we moved on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just entered someone, or something's, territory. A few hours later we heard it, a high-pitched inhuman shriek echoing off the mountainside. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, sending shivers down my spine. Kane and I exchanged terrified glances. Whatever made that sound, it wasn't far away. We quickened our pace, hoping to reach the summit and get a better view of our surroundings. But as we rounded a bend in the trail, we came face to face with a nightmare. There, not 50 yards ahead of us, stood a massive, ape-like creature. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in matted dark fur. But it was the face that haunts me to this day. A twisted, almost human visage with sunken eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence. For a moment, we all stood frozen. Then the creature let out another bone-chilling shriek and charged straight at us. I've never run so fast in my life. Kane and I bolted back down the trail, blind with terror. I don't know how long we ran. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but sheer adrenaline kept me going. I could hear heavy footsteps and angry roars behind us, spurring us to even greater speed. At some point, I realized I couldn't hear Kane anymore. I risked a glance back and saw he had fallen behind. For a split second, our eyes met. The look of absolute horror on his face is seared into my memory. Then he disappeared around a bend in the trail, and I heard his agonized scream cut short. Guilt and terror warred within me, but self-preservation won out. I kept running, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail. Branches whipped at my face and I stumbled over rocks, but nothing could make me slow down. Finally, after what felt like hours, I burst out of the tree line near the base of the mountain. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest settlement, collapsing in exhaustion and babbling about monsters on the mountain. No one believed me, of course. They assumed Kane and I had run into a bear or mountain lion, and that my mind had twisted it into something more fantastic. A search party was sent out, but they found no trace of Kane or the creature I described. In the years since, I've tried to convince myself it was all a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But in my darkest moments, I can still hear that inhuman shriek and see those glowing eyes. Something is out there on that mountain, something that doesn't want to be found. I've never returned to Mount St. Helens, and I never will. The natives were right to fear that place. My only hope is that others will heed the warnings and stay far away from the territory of the skookums. Some secrets are better left undiscovered. Story 25. I was part of the surveying team for the Panama Waterworks project back in 1852. It was grueling work in the unforgiving jungle, but we were making steady progress mapping out the terrain. Nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that fateful day. The air was thick with humidity as we hacked our way through the dense foliage. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. My clothes clung to my skin, drenched and uncomfortable. But we pressed on, driven by our mission to chart this wild land. As we approached a small stream, I heard an odd rustling sound coming from the underbrush. At first I dismissed it as some tropical bird or monkey, but then I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, crouched by the water's edge, was what appeared to be a man. But this was no ordinary man. He was completely naked, his skin caked with mud and grime. Long, matted black hair hung down past his shoulders. For a moment I stood frozen in shock. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some native tribesman, a castaway, or something else entirely? I called out in Spanish, then English, but the creature showed no sign of comprehension. It just stared at me with wild, feral eyes. There was no trace of human intelligence or recognition in that gaze, only raw animal instinct. As I took a hesitant step forward, the being suddenly sprang into action. With surprising speed and agility, it bounded away into the dense jungle growth. Within seconds, it had vanished from sight. My heart was pounding as I turned to my companions. Did you see that?" I stammered. They nodded, looking as stunned as I felt. We all stood in shocked silence for a long moment, trying to process what we had just witnessed. "What in God's name was that thing?" one of the men finally asked. "I don't know," I replied. "But it wasn't human. At least, not fully human." We searched the area, looking for any sign of the creature's presence. But aside from a few unclear footprints in the mud by the stream, there was no trace it had ever been there. It was as if it had simply melted back into the primordial forest from which it came. As we continued our work that day, I couldn't shake the image of those feral eyes from my mind. There was something deeply unsettling about the encounter. This was no ordinary wild man or lost jungle dweller. The way it moved, the look in its eyes, it was like staring into the face of some missing link between man and beast. That night, as we huddled around the campfire, none of us could stop talking about what we had seen. Theories flew back and forth. Some thought it must be a member of some unknown native tribe, driven to isolation in the deepest jungle. Others speculated it could be a feral child, somehow raised by animals in the wild. But I had a different suspicion, one that filled me with both fascination and dread. What if this creature was something else entirely, some sort of undiscovered primate species, more closely related to man than any known ape? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig had me sitting bolt upright, straining my eyes against the darkness. I kept imagining that creature lurking just beyond the firelight, watching us with those haunting eyes. The next morning, we returned to the stream where we had made the sighting. I was determined to find some concrete evidence of the being's existence, but aside from those same faint footprints, there was nothing to be found. No hair, no blood, no tools or artifacts of any kind. It was maddening. As we continued our survey work over the next few days, I found myself constantly scanning the jungle, hoping for another glimpse of the mysterious wild man. But he never reappeared. It was as if he had been nothing more than a shared hallucination. But I knew what I had seen. The memory of that encounter was seared into my mind with perfect clarity. Those eyes, that matted hair, the inhuman grace with which it moved, it was all too real. I became obsessed with trying to learn more. I questioned every local I could find about legends of wild men in the jungle. I pored over explorers' accounts and naturalist journals, searching for any similar sightings. But while there were plenty of vague stories and unsubstantiated rumors, nothing quite matched what we had witnessed. As our expedition drew to a close, I was no closer to answers than I had been that first day. The creature remained an enigma, defying explanation or categorization. Part of me wanted to mount a dedicated search expedition to try and track it down, but another part of me wondered if that would be wise. Perhaps there were some mysteries in this world that were better left unsolved. In the years since, I've often reflected on that strange encounter in the Panamanian jungle. It's colored my entire world view, making me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world and mankind's place in it. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the brutal conditions and isolation had caused some sort of shared delusion among our team. But then I remember the visceral shock I felt in that moment, the ice-cold certainty that I was in the presence of something truly unknown. I've never spoken publicly about what I saw that day. Who would believe such a fantastic tale? But I know what I witnessed was real. Somewhere out there, deep in the unexplored wilds, that creature still roams free. A living fossil, perhaps, or evolution's next great leap forward. Whatever it was, that brief encounter opened my eyes to how little we truly know about our world. There are still profound mysteries out there waiting to be discovered, and sometimes, just sometimes, they reveal themselves in the most startling and unexpected ways. To this day, I can't look at a densely forested area without wondering what secrets it might hold, what undiscovered wonders or terrors might be lurking just out of sight. That wild man of Panama may have eluded scientific classification, but he left an indelible mark on my psyche. I'm an old man now, and my exploring days are long behind me, but I still dream of those feral eyes sometimes, peering out at me from the jungle shadows. And I wonder, what if we had managed to make contact, to bridge the gap between our world and his? What might we have learned? But perhaps it's better this way. Some creatures aren't meant to be understood or categorized. They belong to the wild places of the earth, free from human interference or comprehension. A reminder that no matter how much we think we've tamed this planet, there will always be mysteries beyond our grasp. So if you ever find yourself in a remote jungle and feel eyes watching you from the undergrowth, remember my tale, and know that there are still things in this world that defy explanation, wonders and terrors that lurk just beyond the fringes of our understanding, waiting to be glimpsed by those brave or foolish enough to venture into the unknown.